London, 1901. The gaslights flicker, carriages clatter over cobblestones, and everyone's pretending they're not terrified of the future. The Edwardian era has just begun, a glittering curtain rise after the long, buttoned-up reign of Queen Victoria. The new king, Edward VII, has barely sat on the throne, and already the empire is balancing on a fine edge between elegance and existential dread. Electricity hums through drawing rooms, motorcars cough through the fog, telephones ring like impatient ghosts, and with every shiny new invention comes a brand new regulation to make sure no one enjoys it too much. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. You see, Edwardian London was a paradox in a hat. On one hand, it was the height of sophistication, ballrooms, Art Nouveau and silk-clad optimism. On the other, it was riddled with anxiety about morality, class, and just how fast everything was changing. The city was growing like a weed with a silver spoon. Nearly 7 million people jammed into its streets, and each of them was convinced the other 6 million were doing something improper. The government responded to this puerile panic in the most British way possible, by banning everything that might make anyone, anywhere, slightly uncomfortable. This was the dawn of what you might call the age of nerves. Doctors diagnosed it, newspapers fueled it, and the upper classes performed it theatrically. The world had become too stimulating. Noise, crowds, factory smoke, telegraphs, automobiles, all of it was apparently overloading the delicate Edwardian brain. The solution? More rules, more boundaries. If you couldn't calm your nerves with laudanum or a seaside cure, you could at least feel secure knowing someone was being fined for having too much fun. And so, as Edwardian London marched confidently into modernity, it also created a labyrinth of absurd restrictions. You could buy an automobile, but only if you promised not to drive it faster than a horse could canter. You could attend the theatre, but you better not block anyone's view with your hat. That was practically a crime. And heaven forbid you tried to dance past 11 p.m. or take a photograph on a Sunday. Progress was welcome, but it had to keep its elbows tucked in. Part of this was pure social anxiety. The Edwardians had inherited an empire at its peak, a vast machine built on class hierarchy, colonial certainty, and the belief that British decorum held the world together. But beneath the silken steam lurked a creeping sense that maybe, just maybe, that order was cracking. The working class was getting louder. Women were demanding rights and bicycles. Artists were painting cubes instead of portraits. It was chaos with good posture. So naturally, Parliament's response was to legislate everything from street music to swimwear, because if you can't control the tides of change, you can at least arrest them for loitering. The newspapers loved it. Every day seemed to bring a new scandal or moral emergency. Was London's youth being corrupted by postcards? Were women's ankles leading men to sin? Was the empire collapsing under the weight of jazz? The headlines practically wrote themselves, "Improper whistling in Piccadilly," or "Woman arrested for cycling like she means it." If outrage was an Olympic sport, Edwardian London would have taken home the gold, provided the competition ended by curfew. But here's the thing, beneath all the pearl-clutching and public scolding, there was genuine fear. London was transforming so rapidly that no one knew what counted as normal anymore. In a single decade, they saw the rise of wireless communication, department stores, suffragettes, electric lighting, cinema, and organised labour. Every advancement looked a little like rebellion. The old rules of society, about class, gender and behaviour, were fraying, so people clung to new laws as if they could patch the social fabric. Spoiler, they couldn't, but they certainly gave it a bureaucratic try. Every street corner became a theatre of petty authority. Constables scolded street performers for attracting unruly gatherings. Clerks were fined for singing at work. Even the poor lamplighters, those heroes of nocturnal London, were told to mind their conduct in case their whistling was suggestive. One can only imagine what sort of melody could possibly qualify. You weren't just expected to behave, you were expected to perform your respectability like a public duty. The Edwardian citizen, therefore, lived in a constant state of polite paranoia. You could be fined for laughing too loudly on the Sabbath or for walking a dog without the proper licence. There were bans on mixed bathing, bans on Sunday concerts, bans on unlicensed fortune-telling, so bans on anything that looked like progress in a skirt. London, for all its grandeur, was a city balancing on its moral tiptoes, terrified of slipping into modernity without its gloves on. And yet, that's exactly what makes it fascinating. This was a society desperate to appear composed while quietly trembling underneath. Every new law, every ban, every headline about moral decay was really the sound of a civilization trying to keep its hat straight in a hurricane. The Edwardians wanted the future. They just didn't want it showing up unchaperoned. So welcome to Edwardian London, where elegance met overregulation and anxiety was practically an accessory. The good news? You're alive in one of the most glamorous, exciting eras of British history. The bad news? You'll need a permit for that enthusiasm. Sunday in Edwardian London. The day of rest, reflection, and absolutely no fun whatsoever. While the working week was a grind of factory smoke, clerks' ink stains, and endless errands, Sunday was supposed to be the one day everyone could breathe. Instead, it became a 24-hour marathon of moral suffocation. Because in Edwardian Britain, the Sabbath didn't just belong to God, it also belonged to the loudest people in Parliament who thought smiling too hard might summon the devil. The Sunday observance laws were the relics of earlier centuries, Puritan leftovers reheated for Edwardian respectability. These were the laws that made it illegal to play games, dance, stage performances, or even sell most forms of pleasure on a Sunday. And by pleasure, they meant almost anything that didn't involve church pews or staring pensively at wallpaper. The city might have been bursting with electric lights, cinemas and cabarets, but come Sunday morning, London went dim on purpose. Even the pigeons looked nervous to coo. Imagine it is 1907. You've spent 6 days surviving your boss, your bills, and possibly your own corset. You wake up on Sunday ready to stroll through Hyde Park, maybe hear a brass band or eat an ice cream. And then a constable approaches, moustache quivering with righteousness. "Move along, sir," he says. "It's the Lord's day." You nod respectfully. He eyes your cone suspiciously. "That would be ice cream, would it? Sold after church hours? I'll have to confiscate that for the greater good." Sunday fun was not simply discouraged, it was criminalized. Theatres went dark, music halls were shuttered, pubs were restricted, and even museum doors often stayed closed. In some boroughs, you couldn't buy so much as a ticket for public transport. The reasoning was simple. If people could get around, they might accidentally enjoy themselves. To modernise, it sounds absurd. But to Edwardian reformers, it was an act of national self-control, a weekly moral detox from the intoxication of modern life. Londoners, of course, didn't take this lying down. They found loopholes, lots of them. Sunday strolls turned into walking societies. Secret concerts disguised themselves as sacred recitals, and if you absolutely had to get a drink, you could always declare yourself a traveller, a legal loophole that allowed pubs to serve anyone who claimed to have journeyed from another parish. This led to an entire subculture of Edwardians walking briskly between boroughs, just to qualify for a pint. By the third round, everyone was a pilgrim. The upper classes, naturally, handled the ban in their own special way, by ignoring it. Country houses overflowed with private entertainments on Sundays, luncheons, amateur theatricals, quiet gambling sessions that were only quiet until the champagne was opened. The hypocrisy was staggering. In the same breath that they condemned the working man's pub piano, they applauded the Countess's after-church soiree. It was one law for the masses, another for anyone with a title and a garden. Still, there were enforcers who took their duties seriously. Too seriously. The Lord's Day Observance Society, yes, that was a real organisation, patrolled London like joy-sniffing bloodhounds. They lobbied Parliament, watched street corners, and even took people to court for operating unholy amusements. In one infamous case, a group of children was scolded for playing marbles on the pavement. The marble in question, according to the complainant, rolled in a manner uncoming of the Sabbath. Somewhere in heaven, God probably sighed. Even newspapers weren't safe. Some editors were warned against printing Sunday editions that contained jokes or illustrations, as if laughter itself were a breach of divine law. Others leaned into the absurdity, publishing snide little headlines like, "Breaking, laughter still illegal before Monday." But the humour didn't stop the fines, and London's police courts saw a steady trickle of Sunday offenders, hawkers selling oranges, musicians caught humming in public, and one poor man who was allegedly seen smiling at the wrong hour. The irony, of course, was that this moral seriousness existed alongside an empire that loved excess. Edwardian Londoners could attend champagne-fueled banquets, gamble in clubs, or watch horse races attended by royalty, as long as it wasn't Sunday. The rest of the week was a carnival of capitalism and class, but once the Sabbath arrived, everyone was expected to perform poverty of spirit. For one day at least, the empire was sober, silent, and slightly miserable. Yet beneath all the absurdity, the war on Sunday fun revealed something deeper about the Edwardian psyche. It wasn't just about religion, it was about control. The empire was entering the age of machines, mass media, and social change. Women were marching for votes, workers were striking for rights. Technology was eroding old hierarchies. So the elite, terrified of chaos, tried to enforce order the only way they knew how, through moral policing. If you could regulate the weekend, maybe you could regulate the future, but time has always had other plans. As the decade wore on, the rules began to crumble under the weight of public boredom. The cinemas started opening quietly on Sundays, often under the guise of educational screenings. Music halls began holding charity concerts that just happened to feature comedians and jazz bands. By the eve of World War I, Sunday had become less a day of holy silence and more of a polite suggestion. Still, for that brief, peculiar window in Edwardian history, the city that ruled half the world couldn't even rule its own leisure. London was vast, brilliant, and unstoppable, except on Sundays, when it collectively pretended to be asleep out of fear that God might be peeking through the curtains. The good news, the Edwardians were deeply committed to moral order. The bad news, their idea of fun was illegal 6 days too few. Picture this. It's 1908, you've escaped the soot and clatter of London for a weekend by the sea. You've packed your best straw hat, a bathing costume that weighs as much as a small tent, and dreams of splashing in the waves without judgment. But just as your toe touches the water, whistle! A beach constable storms toward you, notebook in hand, expression grim. "Step away from that lady, sir. You're violating Decency Regulation 47B, mixed bathing." Welcome to the Edwardian seaside, where the only thing more dangerous than drowning was being seen enjoying yourself in proximity to the opposite sex. To modernise, it's hard to imagine that the ocean, a vast, anonymous body of water, was once considered scandalous. But in Edwardian Britain, the seaside was a moral minefield. Men and women could bathe, yes, but not together. Beaches were divided like battlefields, ladies only on one side, gentlemen on the other, with a stretch of no man's land between, patrolled by the watchful attendants ready to blow the whistle on any unauthorised flirtation. Think less Baywatch, more moral inquisition with seaweed. The fear wasn't just about nudity, it was about temptation. Society believed that water had the suspicious ability to loosen both clothes and inhibitions. Even though Edwardian swimwear covered more skin than a modern ski outfit, the idea of men and women frolicking in the same tide was enough to make moral reformers faint into their parasols. One glimpse of an exposed ankle, and civilization might crumble before lunch. The attire itself was a work of tragic genius. Men wore full woolen suits with belts, collars, and sometimes even socks, because nothing says athletic vigour like drowning in tweed. Women's bathing costumes were masterpieces of over-engineering. Long bloomers, skirts, puffed sleeves, and sometimes shoes, all designed to prevent the viewer from glimpsing the forbidden shape of a knee. The fabric clung like regret, and when wet, could weigh 20 pounds. A dip in the sea was less refreshing leisure, and more mild cardio with a side of suffocation. Still, seaside holidays were booming. Railways made coastal resorts like Brighton, Margate, and Scarborough accessible to the working and middle classes, turning beaches into the great equalisers of British society. Or they would have, if morality police hadn't tried to keep everyone in their lanes. Mixed bathing bans varied by town, but the anxiety was national. Local councils passed ordinances faster than you could say, pass the lemonade. Inspectors patrolled with binoculars, scanning for suspicious laughter or unauthorised glances. Some resorts even installed canvas barriers in the surf so the genders couldn't accidentally see each other through waves. Of course, people being people, the rules didn't always hold. Couples found inventive ways to cheat the system. Coincidental paddling became a romantic art form. Lovers would enter the water from separate ends of the beach and accidentally bump into each other halfway. Families declared themselves large mixed parties to sneak through loopholes. And teenagers, always the heroes of social progress, simply waited until dusk and pretended the moonlight counted as camouflage. Even the most respectable seaside visitors couldn't resist poking fun at the absurdity. Postcards of the time depicted flirtatious bathers and cheeky captions like "risking it in real" or "caught in the act of paddling." They were banned in many towns, of course, which only made them sell faster. Nothing sold like scandal, especially the kind printed on cheap cardstock. Behind all this nonsense was a deeper class anxiety. The seaside had once been an elite luxury, aristocrats taking sea cures for their health, attended by servants who never dared to splash. But by the Edwardian era, everyone wanted in on the fun. Working-class families, clerks and shopgirls invaded the same sands where dukes had once sighed dramatically about the air. To the upper crust, this mingling of social ranks and genders was terrifying. If moral purity couldn't separate the classes, perhaps legislation could. Newspapers occasionally stoked the panic with headlines like "disgraceful scenes at the shore" or "indecent mixing of bathers in Bournemouth." Reading between the lines, the disgraceful scenes usually involved someone laughing too loudly or daring to exist without a chaperone. One local magistrate famously declared, "The sea is not an appropriate place for human sociability." Which begs the question, what exactly was the beach for? Drowning respectfully? Of course, hypocrisy flourished. Private beaches at exclusive resorts often allowed controlled mixed bathing for the elite, on the assumption that wealth itself prevented moral decay. Meanwhile, working-class holidaymakers were lectured about propriety while standing knee-deep in freezing water. The message was clear: virtue was a luxury item, but the tide literally was turning. By the late Edwardian years, the younger generation began to rebel. Women ditched their floor-length swimsuits for daring, rational bathing costumes, which scandalously stopped above the calf. Men stopped pretending they were allergic to skin. The first family beaches appeared, cautiously allowing mixed groups, and newspapers slowly shifted from outrage to fascination. What had once been a scandal became a symbol of progress, the empire discovering that sunshine did not, in fact, lead to damnation. By the time war broke out in 1914, many seaside towns had quietly dropped the strictest bans. The Great War would soon make ankle exposure seem like the least of Britain's worries, but for a brief, unforgettable era, Edwardian beaches were battlegrounds between prudery and pleasure, an entire nation determined to keep romance on separate shorelines. So if you ever find yourself at the seaside, wind in your hair, toes in the sand and freedom in the air, remember the brave souls of 1908 who risked it all for a splash. They didn't just break the rules, they made sure we could swim without needing a permit and a priest. The good news, the Edwardians finally learned that the sea belongs to everyone. The bad news, Their bathing suits still haven't dried. Few inventions in history have caused as much panic, praise, and pearl-clutching as the humble bicycle. Today it's just a quiet way to get around or pretend you're eco-friendly. But in Edwardian London, the bicycle was a two-wheeled revolution, and society treated it like the spawn of Satan on spokes. It was accused of everything from moral decay to physical ruin, particularly when women started riding them. Because of course, nothing terrified a Victorian leftover like a woman on two wheels and a sense of direction. By the turn of the 20th century, bicycles were everywhere. They were fast, affordable, and far less judgmental than horses. For men, cycling was a matter of sport and convenience. For women, it was liberation, literal and symbolic. The bicycle meant freedom of movement, fresh air, and the radical ability to go somewhere without a chaperone or a carriage driver. This didn't just challenge etiquette, it challenged the entire architecture of Edwardian control, and that's when the trouble started. Doctors, clergy, and columnists formed a united front against this mechanical menace. Medical journals warned of bicycle face, a supposedly permanent expression of strain and moral decline caused by female cycling. Symptoms included flushed cheeks, wild eyes, and, most scandalously, independence. One London physician even warned that prolonged pedalling could lead to overstimulation of the nerves, a phrase so delicately Victorian it barely hides the panic about women discovering that exercise could be enjoyable. But it wasn't just about biology. Clothing was the real battleground. Traditional women's attire, long skirts, corsets, and layers of fabric made cycling less a sport and more an exercise in suffocation. So women began adapting. Out came bloomers, divided skirts, and shortened hemlines, designed for practicality and accidentally for shock value. Imagine London society watching a woman speed past on a bicycle, her ankles visible, her skirt fluttering like a declaration of war. The streets of Chelsea might as well have hosted an uprising. Newspapers called them bloomer girls, half admiring, half appalled. Moral crusaders declared that these outfits were a menace to decency, while others accused the wearers of trying to ape the masculine. One particularly nervous columnist in the Times lamented, "There is no sight less feminine than a lady bestriding a contraption of wheels," which was rich coming from men who spent their weekends astride horses yelling about foxes. Meanwhile, the police were caught in the middle. Technically, there were no laws banning women from cycling, but there were plenty of ways to make them miserable for doing it. Officers could fine them for reckless riding, improper attire, or obstructing traffic, phrases vague enough to cover anything from a missing petticoat to existing too boldly. One notorious case in 1904 involved a woman fined for causing a disturbance after a group of men followed her shouting obscenities. The court ruled that she had provoked them by cycling alone. A perfect example of Edwardian logic. If harassment occurs, blame the handlebars. Yet despite the backlash, bicycles refused to disappear. In fact, they became fashionable. Queen Alexandra herself was said to own a tricycle version, elegantly designed so she could glide through gardens without risk of scandal. Aristocratic ladies took up cycling clubs, organising group rides with parasols and parasitic etiquette. The upper class turned rebellion into leisure, as they usually did, while working women used the bicycle for actual independence. Shopgirls and typists could now live farther from work, visit friends, or take Sunday rides without permission slips. The streets of London began to hum not just with wheels, but with possibility. Of course, the moralists weren't done. The bicycle, they insisted, was destroying womanhood. One pamphlet warned that constant friction, we all know what that meant, could lead to unseemly physical pleasure. Another claimed that cycling encouraged unmarried women to think themselves self-sufficient. For the Edwardian establishment, this was more alarming than any mechanical risk. A woman who could travel freely might also think freely, and that, to them, was anarchy on pedals. But the bicycle didn't just scandalise, it changed everything from fashion to feminism. Practical clothing became more accepted, corsets loosened, and women's health actually improved thanks to exercise. The suffragette movement even embraced cycling as both symbol and strategy. Photographs from the era show women in votes for women sashes, confidently pedalling through city streets while men shouted disapproval from the sidewalks. Every turn of the wheel felt like a declaration. We can move forward without your permission. The press, always ready to monetize outrage, began running cycling etiquette guides for women, helpful little manuals that managed to combine condescension with catastrophe. Gems included, never coast downhill with your mouth open, avoid laughing too freely, and remember that perspiration is unladylike. Because heaven forbid a woman break a sweat while breaking barriers. Naturally, not everyone hated the change. Progressive voices called the bicycle the freedom machine, praising it for lifting women out of domestic confinement. American suffragist Susan B. Anthony even declared that the bicycle had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. British reformers quietly agreed, though they might have added, "But please, don't do it on a Sunday." By 1910, the scandal had begun to cool. Londoners had bigger things to worry about: cars, strikes, and the creeping shadow of war. The bicycle was no longer shocking. It was simply part of life. Even the most conservative towns began to accept that women could ride without bringing about the apocalypse. It turned out civilization could survive a pair of bloomers. Still, for a few glorious years, the bicycle was both symbol and scandal, a quiet revolution disguised as recreation. It gave women motion, freedom, and the most delicious thing of all, visibility. It's no wonder the Edwardians panicked. Nothing shakes a society built on hierarchy quite like a woman moving faster than expected. The good news, the bicycle gave women power. The bad news, it also gave Edwardian men heart palpitations. There are few things more suspicious to Edwardian authorities than people enjoying themselves in rhythm. Dancing, in their eyes, wasn't just movement, it was moral danger set to music. One spin too many and you might end up in the arms of temptation, or worse, the tabloids. So while London was the capital of empire, invention and social polish, it was also a place where you could legally buy arsenic face powder, but might be fined for waltzing after 11 p.m. The Edwardian dance hall was both the heartbeat and the scandal sheet of the age. By day, these grand spaces were quiet shells of respectability. By night, they pulsed with energy, brass bands, perfume, and the terrifying possibility of cross-class mingling. For the first time, the working and middle classes could afford to dance under the same chandeliers as the gentry, at least metaphorically. That was enough to send moral reformers into a frenzy. Authorities feared that excessive waltzing might lead to spontaneous marriage, or worse, happiness. The problem began with the waltz itself. Imported from Europe decades earlier, it was still viewed by many as dangerously intimate. The partners held each other too close. The movement was circular. The music was catchy. It was everything Edwardian order was not. If a lady allowed a man to guide her through a turn, critics insisted, she might as well be halfway to ruin. Newspapers fretted about the looseness of modern dancing, and columnists complained that certain halls resembled the dens of unregulated pleasure, which naturally made them wildly popular. Dance halls multiplied across London, from opulent establishments in Piccadilly to raucous suburban pavilions where the gramophone blared ragtime until the constable arrived. The working classes adored them. For a few pennies, anyone could escape the grind, dress up, and feel momentarily grand. But to the upper classes and city officials, these halls were ticking time bombs of impropriety. The sight of young men and women meeting without supervision, dancing, laughing, possibly exchanging names, was enough to trigger a parliamentary inquest. Cue the moral crusaders. Societies for the preservation of public decency lobbied to regulate the new dance craze into extinction. Police were ordered to monitor the halls, ensuring that no inappropriate proximity occurred between couples. There were even proposals to ban close dancing altogether, replacing the waltz with wholesome group formations, because nothing kills passion faster than being forced into a government-approved quadrille. Licensing laws followed, demanding that dance halls close early or apply for special permits. Local councils insisted on strict lighting requirements. Dim corners were deemed gateways to sin. Owners were fined if patrons' behaviour crossed into suggestive merriment. Imagine trying to enjoy a lively foxtrot while being watched by a committee of moral accountants, clipboards in hand, measuring the distance between you and your partner like it was an Olympic sport. The hypocrisy was almost impressive. While reformers scolded working-class youths for dancing too freely, the upper crust waltzed with abandon at private soirees, champagne in hand, moral double standards glistening brighter than the chandeliers. At Buckingham Palace, royal balls continued to feature dances far closer than any music hall dared permit. Apparently impropriety was acceptable so long as it came with a title. Still, the anxiety wasn't just about class, it was about change. Edwardian Britain was standing on the edge of modernity, and music was leading the charge. Ragtime, imported from America, scandalised listeners with its syncopated rhythms and sense of fun. Jazz followed soon after, bringing with it whispers of rebellion and bodily freedom. To the Edwardian moralists, this wasn't just music. It was an uprising with good rhythm. But the people didn't care. They danced anyway. Working women spun in borrowed gowns, clerks forgot their ledgers, and factory boys found courage in cheap cologne and brass band beats. For them, the dance hall was democracy in motion, a place where class lines blurred, romance blossomed, and no one cared about your pedigree so long as you could keep time. Not everyone was lucky, though. Police raids were common, with officers bursting into halls to ensure that dancers were sober, separate and stationary. Couples caught holding each other too closely might be escorted out for decency's sake. Some halls were even forced to install partitions to discourage what one inspector described as rhythmic intimacy. The irony? Many of these same halls were used for First World War recruitment rallies just a few years later, because apparently dancing was immoral, but dying together was patriotic. Yet despite the disapproval, the dance hall culture flourished. Its popularity became unstoppable, especially among women. For many young Edwardian women, dancing offered something more than fun. It offered autonomy. Here was one of the few public spaces where they could choose their partners, lead conversations, and express emotion without supervision. The dance floor became a silent battlefield for equality, and every spin was a small rebellion. By 1913, London's moral watchdogs were losing the fight. They couldn't ban rhythm any more than they could ban weather. Dance halls became social institutions, celebrated in songs, postcards, and gossip columns. Reformers still muttered about the moral hazards of melody, but the public had moved on. A new generation had discovered that a few hours of dancing did less harm to society than a decade of repression. Looking back, it's almost charming how frightened they were of joy. But beneath the laughter, the Edwardian panic over dancing reveals something deeper. A society so terrified of freedom that it tried to legislate rhythm. They could ban the lights, limit the hours, and measure the inches between dancers, but they couldn't stop the beat. The good news? Edwardians learned that happiness has better footwork than authority. The bad news? Some reformers still believed jazz was a gateway drug to democracy. If there's one thing Edwardian London could not stand, it was joy at the wrong volume. The city that roared with factory whistles, tram bells and carriage wheels somehow decided that music was the real menace. By 1905, London's moralisers and respectable citizens were in open war against organ grinders, buskers, and anyone whose tunes dared to compete with their peace or their egos. Apparently the real crime wasn't theft. It was being louder than your neighbour's self-importance. To understand the absurdity, you must picture Edwardian London at its noisiest. Hawkers shouting, horses clopping, milkmen clanging, trains shrieking, chimneys hissing, and the occasional drunk poet reciting in an alley. And yet, amidst this daily chaos, the public fury focused on one humble sound, the hand-cranked barrel organ. Street musicians had been a fixture of London life since the Victorian days, playing everything from sentimental ballads to patriotic marches. They were the city's unofficial soundtrack, portable, unlicensed, and apparently unforgivable. The complaints poured in from London's upper and middle classes, who saw organ grinders not as entertainers but as sonic invaders. Newspaper editorials thundered against the ceaseless mechanical din which drives respectable citizens to distraction. Politicians wrung their hands over the supposed epidemic of nervous disorders caused by music in the streets. Doctors even chimed in, claiming that the tunes were responsible for headaches, hysteria, and, my favourite, acute irritation of the moral faculties. Because nothing says moral decay like a cheerful rendition of Rule Britannia outside your townhouse. The loudest and most humorless voice in this crusade was none other than Charles Babbage, the father of the modern computer and, ironically, the patron saint of anti-noise fury. Before his death in 1871, Babbage had waged a personal vendetta against street musicians, claiming they ruined his calculations and his sanity. His ghost seemed to haunt the Edwardians. Every few years, some new committee would rise up demanding stricter controls, all in the name of public tranquility. It was like clockwork, only angrier and less rhythmic. By the early 1900s, local councils began issuing new ordinances under the Police Act, giving constables power to arrest or fine musicians deemed a public nuisance. The vague wording meant that nearly any sound could qualify. Was the music too cheerful? Arrest? Too sad? Arrest? Played near a window where someone important was reading? Immediate arrest. Some officers even counted how many minutes a tune was repeated before declaring it intolerable repetition. Heaven help the poor organ grinder with a limited playlist. The irony, of course, was that Londoners loved their street performers, at least the ones they personally enjoyed. Children danced, servants dropped coins, and working-class crowds gathered to sing along. The music gave texture to the city's grey life. But the well-to-do weren't impressed. To them, the real problem wasn't the sound itself, it was who was making it. Street music was performed by immigrants, especially Italians, the poor and the unlicensed, the great Edwardian trifecta of suspicion. One magistrate called organ grinders the audible proof of urban decay. Another declared that music in the streets is the badge of an uncivilized people. Nothing like racism with a metronome, so the city cracked down. Licenses were restricted, instruments were confiscated, and constables patrolled fashionable districts like Knightsbridge and Mayfair, silencing any tune that dared drift too close to a banker's nap. Organ grinders adapted by playing quickly and moving constantly, like guerrilla musicians, ambushing ears and vanishing before the truncheon arrived. Some would post lookouts at street corners, while others bribed sympathetic officers with a coin or a song. In the battle between music and authority, rhythm often had better reflexes. Still, the laws took their toll. By 1910, the once lively symphony of London's streets was fading. Public spaces grew quieter, and some said lonelier. Writers like George Orwell later remembered how the disappearance of organ grinders marked the end of something human in the city's soundscape. The Edwardians, in their pursuit of silence, had sanitized the soul of their streets, and yet even as they suppressed melody, they replaced it with something worse. The noise of progress, motorcars, telephones, factory sirens, the industrial roar that would soon drown out any violin. The same citizens who complained about music found themselves surrounded by the mechanical chaos, far louder and far less charming. The irony could have danced a waltz if irony were allowed to dance. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. The musical spirit refused to die. It merely went indoors. Working-class pubs and dance halls, when they weren't being raided for waltzing too passionately, became the new homes for song. Street musicians reinvented themselves as cabaret performers or early gramophone stars. The empire that once silenced its organ grinders soon found itself exporting ragtime records and marching tunes around the globe. The melody survived, it just traded cobblestones for commercial appeal. Still, the Edwardian war on noise remains one of history's great exercises in misplaced energy. While Parliament debated how to rid the city of buskers, the real racket, Inequality, smog and urban overcrowding went unaddressed. But hey, at least nobody had to endure an accordion solo on their way to complain about poverty. There's a certain tragic comedy to it all. London, a city built on the clang of empire and industry, decided that melody was the one sound too offensive to bear, and in doing so it silenced a class of people whose only crime was trying to make a living through music. The good news? The songs of the street never truly vanished, they just changed instruments. The bad news? The only thing louder than Edwardian London was its hypocrisy. Imagine you've just paid £1 for a good seat at the theatre, ready for a night of drama, romance, and perhaps the faint scent of questionable perfume from the next row. The orchestra tunes, the curtain rises, and you see nothing. Because directly in front of you is not an actress, but an ecosystem of feathers, fruit, lace, and despair. You've fallen victim to the Edwardian hat crisis, a national emergency in which women's fashion collided head-first with the laws of physics, and the rest of London suffered the consequences. Edwardian hats were not accessories, they were events. Some were so large they could have been rented as summer homes. Others resembled small gardens under siege by taxidermy. Feathers from ostriches, egrets, and birds of paradise sprouted from brims that stretched a foot in every direction. Artificial fruit, lace ribbons, and entire bouquets decorated these towering marvels, all held in place by hat pins sharp enough to kill a man, or at least pierce his dignity. It all looked fabulous until you tried to sit behind one. Theatres, concert halls, and music halls quickly became battlegrounds between fashion and visibility. A typical evening's entertainment might involve as much glaring and muttering as acting. Gentlemen fumed, short-sighted matrons complained, and newspapers declared that no play can survive the millinery menace. If you couldn't see the stage, at least you could admire the architectural integrity of someone's headwear. The problem escalated fast. By 1907, theatres began posting warnings. Ladies wearing large hats are respectfully requested to remove them. But respect rarely worked against £3 of tulle and ego. Some women refused on principle, declaring it indecent to appear bareheaded in public. Others insisted their hats were too elaborate to remove. Untying one was like dismantling a bridge. The result? Chaos, hissing, and in one case at the Gaiety Theatre, an actual brawl involving a hatpin and a playbill. The press naturally had a field day. Cartoonists filled columns with images of despairing men crushed beneath feathered domes. One illustration from Punch showed a man leaning sideways in agony as a gigantic hat devoured half the stalls. Another article reported that a single hat had obscured the leading man, 2 supporting actresses, and most of Act 3. It was fashion, a structural engineering, and public safety hazard. Men's groups, ever eager to protest something, formed societies demanding legal action. The Anti-Hat League claimed that hats violated the natural rights of the paying audience. Pamphlets circulated proposing hat-free zones, complete with diagrams showing acceptable brim diameters. In an age of suffragettes and labour unrest, this became the issue that got Parliament's attention. Theatres lobbied for official support, and in 1909, local councils began drafting bylaws banning large hats during performances. Predictably, this didn't go down well with women. Fashion columnists cried foul, accusing men of trying to legislate femininity. If gentlemen find themselves blinded, one writer snapped in The Queen, perhaps they should learn to tilt their heads. Others argued that hats were not just style, they were armour. A proper Edwardian woman didn't leave the house without one. Being hatless in public was considered half-dressed, almost scandalous. To demand removal was to demand exposure. And if you've spent an hour balancing a decorative aviary on your scalp, you weren't about to surrender it for a stranger's view of the stage. Yet even among women, tempers flared. Smaller hat wearers resented the skyscraper styles of the fashion elite, whose plumed monstrosities blocked sunlight, conversation, and sometimes airflow. Social satirists joked that London's theatre-goers were evolving longer necks out of necessity. Playwrights began including jokes about hats the size of moral superiority. Meanwhile, the millinery industry raked in profits, producing ever more extravagant creations for women eager to outshine both the stage and each other. The moral reformers, naturally, couldn't resist joining the fray. They denounced the hat trend as evidence of vanity and waste. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the sinful plumage of pride. Animal welfare advocates, quite rightly, condemned the slaughter of exotic birds for fashion. One society even published gruesome leaflets showing the carcasses of egrets beside dainty bonnets, captioned, "Would you wear a murder?" For once, morality, conservation and public irritation shared a common cause. In 1911, the theatre hat law was unofficially adopted by several London venues. Ushers were instructed to request hat removal politely before curtain up. Polite quickly turned to firm. Some women complied, others left in protest, feathers trembling with indignation. But slowly practicality won. New hat fashions, smaller, sleeker, more structured, began to appear. Designers like Coco Chanel championed simplicity over excess, proving you could look elegant without needing scaffolding. By the outbreak of the First World War, the great hats had vanished from theatres entirely. Wartime austerity, practicality and rationing dealt the final blow. Fabric and feathers gave way to uniforms and headscarves, and the notion of blocking someone's view with a 2-foot brim suddenly felt absurd. The great hat blockade was over, and Londoners could finally see the stage again, literally and figuratively. But for a glorious, ridiculous decade, the Edwardian hat reigned supreme, a marvel of beauty, defiance and social tension perched precariously on every fashionable head. It was both a symbol of status and a weapon of mild destruction. The good news? The era's greatest engineering feats weren't bridges or battleships, they were hats. The bad news? You needed binoculars to watch a play and possibly armour to survive intermission. Picture Edwardian London at sunset, gas lamps flickering, hansom cabs rolling by, lovers strolling arm in arm through Hyde Park. It all looks terribly romantic until the kiss. One chaste, delicate, utterly harmless kiss. And suddenly, out of the mist emerges a policeman, notebook at the ready, expression somewhere between outrage and indigestion. "Excuse me, sir," he says, "I'll have to ask you to step away from that woman and your own sense of affection." Because in Edwardian London, a public kiss wasn't just scandalous, it was practically a felony. To the Edwardian moral mind, physical affection was like absinthe, intoxicating, foreign, and bound to lead to chaos. Public kissing was seen as a contagious disease of manners spreading from parks to train stations to, heaven forbid, public houses. The city was full of rules, both written and implied, about how one should behave in public. And near the top of that invisible rulebook was, never demonstrate love in a way that might remind others it exists. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain was still nursing a Victorian hangover, an obsession with propriety that made even basic humanity suspicious. The Edwardians might have loosened their collars a bit, but they still drew the line at lips. A public kiss implied not only passion, but the terrifying possibility that people had bodies. That alone was enough to send moral crusaders running for their fainting couches. The law itself was vague, which made it all the more dangerous. Under the Vagrancy Act and Town Police Clauses Act, indecent behaviour could mean anything an offended observer decided it meant. And offended observers were everywhere. City watchmen, self-appointed moral guardians, and elderly ladies whose hobby was being scandalised in public. If a constable saw you holding hands too long or leaning too close on a park bench, you could be charged with conduct likely to offend public decency. A chaste kiss could cost more than dinner, if you survived the scandal. Police reports from the period tell some absurd stories. In 1903, a young couple in Battersea Park was fined 5 shillings for improper familiarity. Their crime? He kissed her on the cheek after she tripped over a pebble. Another case involved a man reprimanded for kissing his fiancée goodbye at Victoria Station, in full daylight surrounded by the luggage. The magistrate scolded him for introducing continental customs to respectable England. Apparently passion was something best left to foreigners, preferably contained in novels where it couldn't spread. Of course, the crackdown wasn't evenly applied. Class mattered. A working-class couple kissing in a park was indecent. An aristocratic couple embracing in a carriage was romantic. The newspapers adored this hypocrisy. The Illustrated Police News routinely published breathless accounts of kissing scandals, complete with sketches of the accused mid-smooch, an act of moral outrage drawn in loving detail. Londoners pretended to be appalled while secretly buying extra copies. Then came the railway stations, ground zero for public displays of affection. Farewells before long journeys were fertile ground for emotional chaos, and no one could stop the tide of kisses that accompanied the age of steam. The platforms of Paddington and Euston became accidental theatres of human feeling, with departing soldiers, lovers, and families embracing like they might never meet again. The moral reformers were horrified. One reverend called the station farewells the modern Babylon, warning that unchaperoned women might fall prey to emotional impulsiveness. Translation, she might cry and hug someone. Society barely survived. The absurdity didn't stop there. In 1910, several London Underground attendants were instructed to discourage lingering farewells near station entrances. Posters were printed politely reminding passengers that sentiment delays progress. Imagine being told by the city that love was disrupting the timetable, yet people ignored it, as lovers always do. The more the authorities tried to regulate affection, the more Londoners seemed determined to practice it in plain sight. A quiet rebellion made of lips and courage. Still, the anxiety had roots deeper than prudery. Public order was sacred to Edwardian sensibility. The empire was built on discipline, hierarchy, and appearances. Kissing in public blurred all three. It ignored class distinction, challenged authority, and suggested that personal feelings mattered more than social duty. A kiss between a maid and a clerk, or a soldier and a seamstress, defied the rigid roles that kept society neatly divided. For moralists, that was the real threat. Not passion, but equality. Of course, hypocrisy hummed beneath it all. The same newspapers that condemned public indecency ran serialized love stories brimming with stolen kisses. The same city that outlawed affection built entire industries around romance novels, postcards, and sentimental music hall songs. London wanted passion. It just wanted it behind closed doors, preferably under supervision and with lace curtains drawn. And yet, even in this suffocating atmosphere, the human heart refused to shut up. Lovers met in parks under gaslight, in trams, in foggy alleys where the world couldn't see. The act of kissing became almost political, a small defiance against the idea that decorum should trump desire. When World War I arrived just a few years later, the whole illusion of restraint collapsed. Suddenly, young couples were kissing openly in the streets before trains carried them to the front. No one dared call it indecent anymore. The war had rewritten the rules. Love, it turned out, was the last thing anyone wanted to censor. But in the Edwardian years before the world cracked open, affection was something to be hidden, whispered, and ideally never photographed. Society wanted love to exist, but quietly, like good wallpaper or dental hygiene. The good news? The Edwardians proved that love can't be outlawed. The bad news? They certainly gave it a citation for loitering. If Edwardian London had a national sport, it wasn't cricket, it was moral panic. And nowhere did that panic thrive better than on the printed page. To the Edwardian establishment, literature was a dangerous substance, like gin, but for the imagination. Every book was a potential gateway drug to corruption, especially if it involved love, lust, or anyone enjoying themselves outside wedlock. Apparently, reading about sin was worse than committing it, as long as you used proper grammar. By 1900, Britain had developed a full-blown censorship obsession. The Victorians had already laid the groundwork with their tireless crusades against obscenity, but the Edwardians perfected it with bureaucracy. At the heart of it all was the Obscene Publications Act, a law so vaguely worded it could make a library blush. Anything judged to deprave or corrupt the reader could be banned, burned, or used as courtroom evidence. And who got to decide what counted as depraved? Usually, someone who hadn't read it past the title. It was an era where moral watchdogs stalked literature like unpaid detectives. They read with furrowed brows, magnifying glasses, and the grim satisfaction of people who truly believed their discomfort was a civic duty. Whole societies sprang up to fight the menace of literature. The National Vigilance Association, the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and a dozen others whose members seemed suspiciously interested in the very books they condemned. They pored over pages in the name of purity, which must have been awkward when their favourite evidence was Chapter 6. The targets were rarely random. Popular authors, especially those who dared to discuss class, sex, or women's independence, were prime suspects. George Bernard Shaw's plays were branded improper for discussing prostitution. D.H. Lawrence, not yet famous but already problematic, had manuscripts whispered about like contraband. Even Oscar Wilde's ghost still haunted London censors. His trials a decade earlier had set the tone. The lesson was clear. Imagination was only respectable if it behaved. Magistrates took their duty as moral referees with theatrical seriousness. In one notorious case, a bookseller was fined for distributing a French novel described as too continental for English digestion. The prosecution helpfully quoted offending passages aloud in court, prompting several jurors to blush, one to faint, and a reporter to take copious notes for his next column. Another trial involved a cheap romance novel, seized because it contained too many adjectives suggestive of flesh. One can only imagine the horror. But censorship wasn't just about sex, it was about control. Books that questioned the social order were just as dangerous as those that hinted at unbuttoned corsets. Political pamphlets, socialist tracts, and feminist essays were scrutinised with equal suspicion. Anything that encouraged independent thought risked being labelled subversive. The establishment feared that if people started reading freely, they might start thinking freely. And then who knows what could happen? Democracy, reform, women voting, the horror. Of course, the bans only made the books more popular. If the Edwardians excelled at anything, it was turning scandal into marketing. Once a title was declared immoral, sales soared. Booksellers wrapped them in plain brown paper. Readers whispered passwords to get them. And lending libraries developed special collections hidden behind locked doors. For the right customer, a librarian might wink and say, "We do have something French in the back." The irony was almost poetic. While moral crusaders lectured the public about purity, the general population was sneaking around reading the very things they condemned. In back alleys and tea rooms, clerks and typists devoured novels that challenged everything from marriage to empire. Women in particular found liberation in fiction. Stories about passion and rebellion gave them glimpses of a world beyond propriety. Censors, terrified of awakening female desire, or worse, female opinion, redoubled their efforts. But the ink was already out of the bottle. Publishers, meanwhile, became tricksters. Some printed expurgated editions, sanitizing novels by removing scandalous lines. She unbuttoned her. Editor's note, sentence removed for decency. Others simply changed titles to dodge detection. A racy French import might become the moral decline of Parisian society, thus transforming erotica into anthropology. Readers were in on the joke. If a book claimed to be for educational purposes only, it was almost certainly filthy. Yet even amid the moral madness, a quiet rebellion brewed. Intellectuals, writers, and reformers began defending literature as essential to national health. You cannot educate a people by censoring their minds, argued one essayist in the New Age magazine. Shaw himself famously quipped that indecency is only another word for honesty, which naturally only made censors more indecently angry. By 1910, the old guard's grip was loosening. The flood of new media, cheap printing, serialized fiction, and the rise of cinema made it impossible to police every imagination. The empire of censorship was cracking under the weight of its own outrage. Still, the Edwardians left a curious legacy. They proved that no era is too modern to fear ideas. Their bans revealed as much about their insecurities as their morals. Beneath all the pearl-clutching was a society terrified of exposure, of desire, of dissent, of the messy humanity that books insisted on describing. Reading to them wasn't just entertainment, it was subversion. And yet, despite all their efforts, Edwardian London remained a city of readers. Behind lace curtains and locked drawers, novels circulated like whispered secrets, feeding imaginations that refused to stay proper. Every banned book was a quiet rebellion, every naughty thought a step toward a freer mind. The good news? The Edwardians never managed to outlaw curiosity. The bad news? They certainly tried to proofread it to death. Medicine in Edwardian London was a curious thing, half science, half stage performance, and all chaos. The city that produced the stethoscope and X-ray machines also produced men who sold miracle tonics, brewed in bathtubs, and dentists who operated with less training than a blacksmith. Health was fashionable, and that was precisely the problem. If it made you giggle or feel better, the government probably wanted to ban it. By the early 1900s, London was obsessed with modern medicine. Hospitals gleamed with sterile ambition. Medical schools churned out graduates in spotless coats, and the upper classes held soirees where they discussed the latest treatments the way they once discussed art. But beneath that veneer of progress thrived a seedy underbelly of quackery so inventive it deserved a museum. Anyone with a white coat, a moustache, and the confidence of a liar could open a clinic and start healing the nation. Unlicensed practitioners were everywhere. Some offered magneto-electrical cures that involved strapping patients to buzzing contraptions allegedly powered by the cosmos. Others promised vitality restorers, brewed from ingredients best left unidentified. Londoners desperate for relief from everything, neuralgia, nerves, heartbreak, lined up outside these shops, because at least the quacks didn't lecture them about moral restraint like the real doctors did. The only thing more common than tuberculosis was medical fraud. The government, alarmed that its citizens might accidentally feel better without permission, began cracking down. The Medical Act had been introduced back in Victorian times to protect the public from unqualified practitioners, but Edwardian lawmakers expanded it with new zeal. Anyone caught impersonating a doctor could face fines, imprisonment, or, if they were especially successful, public humiliation in the press. Still, enforcement was laughable. It was easier to fake a diploma than to find a police officer who could tell Latin from laundry instructions. Dentistry was its own horror show. Tooth pullers, as they were lovingly called, set up stalls in markets, yanking molars out to the sound of passing trams. Anesthesia was optional, usually replaced with a quick prayer and a strong arm. Some practitioners dabbled in gas entertainment, small performances where spectators could inhale nitrous oxide and laugh hysterically. It was billed as a scientific amusement until the government decided fun and medicine shouldn't mix. Laughing gas was swiftly restricted, partly for safety reasons, but mostly because officials worried it encouraged frivolity because God forbid the working class find joy between toothaches. The line between medicine and entertainment blurred everywhere. Travelling healing exhibitions promised instant cures through light therapy, electricity, or animal magnetism. A man named Professor Hollingsworth claimed he could cure any ailment with colour. Customers sat under tinted lamps while he shouted encouraging adjectives. In one case, a patient reported feeling slightly warmer, which Hollingsworth declared a triumph of modern science. Predictably, he was later arrested for tax evasion, not pseudoscience. Patent medicines, too, flooded the market. Bottles of syrup and powder sold with the names like Dr. Merriweather's Miracle Elixir or Reverend Percy's Nerve Wine. Many contained alarming doses of alcohol, opium, or cocaine. A few worked, but only because they replaced your illness with euphoria. One popular tonic, Mother Seigel's syrup, was advertised as curing constipation, melancholy, and marital disappointment. It sold by the thousands. Unsurprisingly, the government decided this kind of happiness was suspicious and began banning unregistered tonics. Approved medicines were required to list their ingredients, which quickly reduced their effectiveness and their fun. But not all pseudo-medicine was dangerous. Some were simply ridiculous. Face rejuvenators, mechanical masks attached to hand pumps, promised to restore youth by circulating fresh etheric energy. Electric corsets claimed to improve posture and libido, though most simply gave mild shocks at inopportune moments. There were even vibrating belts for female hysteria, which were banned not because they failed, but because they succeeded a little too well. The Edwardian government may have feared many things, but women achieving contentment topped the list. The growing crackdown wasn't entirely misplaced. Some quacks were downright lethal. In 1909, a fake surgeon named Walter T. Rainford made headlines after performing experimental operations in a rented basement using scissors and whiskey. Several of his patients died. The survivors testified that he seemed rather tired and unsanitary. Rainford's defence: "I believed enthusiasm was qualification enough." Parliament disagreed, and his conviction helped inspire the Stricter Dentists Act and new oversight boards. Still, the zeal for banning extended far beyond the dangerous. The authorities, in their quest for order, targeted anything pseudo-medical, even harmless amusements. Public demonstrations of hypnosis, for instance, were outlawed after several spectators fainted in theatrical trances. One hypnotist was fined for inducing unconsciousness for entertainment purposes. The line between healing, showmanship, and sin blurred until no one could tell which side of the stethoscope they stood on. And behind all this regulation lay a deeper fear that science was outpacing morality. Electricity, psychology, and chemistry were reshaping medicine faster than the Edwardian conscience could keep up. The idea that a machine or a pill could manipulate human emotions felt dangerously close to sorcery. Reformers preferred illness over uncertainty. At least illness behaved according to tradition. Yet despite every crackdown, people still sought miracle cures. Because when real doctors cost a fortune and life expectancy hovered just above optimistic, hope was its own medicine. Quacks survived not because they fooled the masses, but because the system itself was sick. Too elitist, too slow, too sceptical of comfort. For every conman selling nerve powder, there were 100 patients desperate to believe in it. By the time World War I arrived, the great era of Edwardian medical madness was fading. Modern regulation, improved science, and wartime necessity buried the quacks beneath antiseptic efficiency. But the spirit of those days lingered, a strange mix of gullibility, optimism, and defiance. The good news: medicine finally learned to separate science from snake oil. The bad news: the Edwardians were already high on the snake oil when they made that decision. Few things scream innocence louder than a child clutching a melting ice cream cone on a hot day. But in Edwardian London, that exact image made moral reformers break out in hives. To them, it wasn't adorable, it was apocalyptic. Those cheerful street vendors, ringing their bells and handing out penny ices, were not symbols of summer bliss. They were, apparently, the Pied Pipers of corruption. In the grand ledger of Edwardian sin, gambling and gin were serious offences. But nothing struck fear into the heart of a reformer like the sound of an ice cream cart. You see, Edwardian authorities had a complicated relationship with pleasure. They tolerated a little fun, provided it was performed indoors, in moderation, and preferably while wearing gloves. Street ice cream, however, broke every rule. It was public, affordable, and worst of all, delicious. Children weren't addicted to sugar, they were addicted to joy, which was obviously more dangerous. The ice cream menace, as some newspapers dramatically called it, began in the late Victorian era when Italian immigrants popularised cheap frozen treats across London. By the early 1800s, hundreds of vendors, many from Naples, Genoa and Sicily, roamed the streets pushing handcarts filled with ice and dreams. they became fixtures in working-class neighbourhoods, bringing a rare taste of luxury to children who otherwise thought dessert meant bread with treacle. But to the self-proclaimed guardians of morality, this was chaos on wheels. Reformers fretted that these vendors were corrupting the youth, though exactly how was never clearly explained. Some claim the treats were made from unhygienic milk, a valid concern in the days before pasteurisation, while others swore the vendors laced their ices with opium, alcohol, or continental immorality. One journalist even suggested that Italian ice cream contained foreign stimulants designed to excite base appetites. In reality, the worst ingredient was probably yesterday's snow mixed with hope. But xenophobia added extra spice to the hysteria. The immigrant vendors, nicknamed Hokey Pokey Men after their sales cry, "Ecco un poco," here's a little bit, became targets of suspicion. Politicians warned that these foreign influences were leading British children astray. Cartoonists drew exaggerated caricatures of swarthy ice cream sellers luring angelic little girls with cones and devilish smiles. It was absurd but effective. The phrase hokey pokey itself became shorthand for something slightly disreputable, which must have made ordering dessert feel like a moral gamble. Public health officials then entered the fray. They launched investigations into the alleged dangers of street ice cream, brandishing thermometers and clipboards like weapons. Some of their findings were genuinely horrifying. Vendors often reused wooden spoons without washing them, stored ice beside manure carts, and left their mixtures uncovered in the summer heat. London's sanitation laws were only beginning to catch up with the modern age, and food safety often meant hope for the best. One inspector described a vendor's cart as an unholy marriage between a dairy and a coal scuttle. Still, the government's reaction was typically Edwardian: regulate it until no one could enjoy it. New laws required ice cream sellers to obtain licenses, submit to surprise inspections, and label their carts with their full names and addresses. Imagine trying to sell a penny cone while being treated like a fugitive. Vendors also had to register their storage rooms with local authorities, essentially declaring their freezers as potential crime scenes. Those who failed to comply risked fines or confiscation, and yet the trade thrived. Despite all the moral lectures and municipal red tape, Londoners adored their hokey pokey. The treats were cheap, refreshing, and symbolically democratic. Poor and rich alike could share the same flavour. Children followed vendors like Pied Pipers, clutching their pennies, while adults snuck a taste when no one respectable was looking. The more society frowned, the more irresistible the cones became. Ice cream had gone rogue, and the empire could do nothing about it. The backlash reached its absurd peak around 1908, when one London council proposed banning vendors near schools to prevent loitering and temptation. Another suggested outlawing ice cream sales on Sundays because apparently the law disapproved of dairy. Letters flooded newspapers debating the moral risks of frozen pleasure. One particularly agitated correspondent claimed that children who frequent the hokey pokey carts develop a restless temperament, a yearning for foreign ways, and a disregard for wholesome English fare. Heaven forbid a scoop of lemon ice awaken cosmopolitan tendencies. The vendors, for their part, mostly ignored the nonsense. They kept ringing their bells, serving cones, and inventing ingenious methods to keep ice cold before refrigeration was widespread. They wrapped their wares in layers of sawdust and wool, creating portable freezers that baffled the British public. Some even became minor celebrities, known by name in their neighbourhoods. Children remembered them fondly for decades afterward, not as corruptors, but as summer's heroes. Ironically, it was science, not censorship, that finally tamed the ice cream menace. By the 1910s, modern factories began producing hygienically packaged ices in bulk, sold through proper shops rather than carts. Sanitation improved, pasteurisation became law, and the old street vendors slowly disappeared. But they left behind a legacy of joy wrapped in scandal, proof that in Edwardian London, even dessert could be political. Looking back, the panic over ice cream says more about the Edwardians than it does about sugar. This was a society that feared pleasure almost as much as disease. Anything cheap, cheerful, and accessible to the working class was instantly suspect. The hokey-pokey man's crime wasn't poisoning children, it was making them happy without permission. The good news? Ice cream survived the empire's moral meltdown. The bad news? Every lick came with a side of social panic. The Edwardians loved to toast the empire, but preferably not in public. A pint, it seemed, was a private affair, ideally consumed behind closed curtains with the moral shame of a small crime. In early 20th century London, alcohol was everywhere and yet somehow nowhere. You could build a battleship for the empire, but heaven forbid you ordered a pint in public. The irony was baked into British culture itself. Beer had been the nation's lifeblood for centuries, safer than water, cheaper than wine, and blessedly effective at making politics tolerable. But by the Edwardian era, public drinking had turned into a moral battleground. Reformers, politicians, and teetotalers all agreed that alcohol was the root of civilization's decline, though notably, they came to that conclusion while sipping sherry in their drawing rooms. At the heart of this moral crusade were the drunkenness laws, a series of Victorian holdovers designed to make being drunk in public not just embarrassing but illegal. If you staggered, sang too loudly, or even sat down too cheerfully on a curb, you could be arrested for disorderly conduct. Police records from Edwardian London are littered with tragicomic entries. Woman fined for singing hymns too joyfully. Man detained for embracing lamppost. The city wasn't short of criminals, just people whose evenings went on slightly too long. The real panic, though, wasn't about men. It was about women. The sight of a woman in a pub sent shockwaves through polite society. It violated everything the Edwardians believed about femininity, decorum, and self-restraint. Respectable ladies, one London magistrate warned, have no business in such places of vice. That the same places of vice were often owned by respectable gentlemen was beside the point. Pubs were considered masculine territory, smoky, loud, and filled with the sort of working men who didn't appreciate moral lectures with their ale. When women did venture in, reformers went into full crisis mode. Newspapers ran scandalised headlines like "Ladies in the Public House, a New Menace," and "The Decline of Modesty in Bermondsey." Some temperance campaigners argued that female drinking was worse than male because it corrupted both womanhood and motherhood. A drunk man was unfortunate. A drunk woman was civilization's apocalypse in a hat. As a result, local councils introduced restrictions designed to make pubs as unwelcoming as possible for women. Some banned women entirely after certain hours. Others forced landlords to install ladies' parlours, tiny isolated rooms where women could sip lemonade in exile, while their husbands enjoyed the real drinks next door. The message was clear. The empire could tolerate women running households or factories or charitable empires, but not bar tabs. Meanwhile, public beer gardens, those cheerful open-air venues that had sprung up in imitation of German leisure culture, became the next casualties. They were seen as dangerously democratic, people of different classes and genders mingling freely over lager and laughter. Reformers shuddered at the thought. The open air, one columnist warned, encourages abandon. Apparently, fresh oxygen was a moral accelerant. Municipalities began tightening licensing laws, restricting music and banning outdoor alcohol sales near parks. A cheerful sing-along with a pint could now earn you a fine for public nuisance. The most fervent opponents of drinking were the temperance societies, who treated sobriety like a crusade and gin like Satan in liquid form. The Band of Hope, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and countless others held rallies, parades and lectures, often featuring horrifying props, a model liver in a jar, or posters showing a mother abandoning her baby for a beer. They argued that Britain's greatness was drowning in hops, and that the empire's moral fibre was disintegrating one pint at a time. Their speeches were dramatic, but the statistics were too. Alcohol abuse was rampant in some areas, especially among the working poor trapped in long hours, low wages, and miserable housing. For many, the pub wasn't decadence, it was survival. It offered warmth, light, and community when home was dark, cold, and overcrowded. Reformers saw sin. The drinkers saw relief. Still, Parliament bowed to the pressure. In 1902, the Licensing Act tightened control over opening hours and increased the powers of local magistrates to revoke licences. By 1910, it was nearly impossible to open a new pub in London without a moral background check. Sunday drinking was restricted, late-night hours curtailed, and landlords forced to police their own patrons under threat of losing their livelihoods. Even publicans began complaining that they were expected to serve beer like doctors prescribe medicine, sparingly and with paperwork. And then there was the blacklist. Repeat offenders, those charged multiple times with drunkenness, could be banned from all licensed premises. Their names were posted in public houses like wanted criminals. Imagine walking into your local pub to find your reputation pinned up above the fireplace next to the dartboard. The shame was supposed to sober you up. It rarely did. Yet, as with most Edwardian restrictions, the people found ways around them. Supper clubs and coffee houses quietly served liquor under the counter. Working men took to beer runs, buying bottles in bulk before closing hours. Women gathered into private kitchens to drink secretly, inventing what would later be called the hen night. The more the state tried to suppress drinking, the more creative the drinkers became. And then, as if to underline the absurdity, Edwardian society continued to celebrate champagne-fueled aristocratic parties, gentlemen's clubs stocked with brandy, and lavish banquets where the wine flowed like empire propaganda. Public drunkenness was disgraceful, private inebriation was culture. The hypocrisy could be measured in gallons. By the time World War I began, the government's tone shifted from moral to practical. Drunken workers were slowing munitions production, and soldiers were getting too merry before deployment. So they tightened laws again, introducing early closing hours and rationing. "The nation needs sober men," declared one official, and the pubs sighed, the people shrugged, and Britain continued drinking through it all. The good news, the Edwardians finally recognised that pubs weren't dens of sin but social lifelines. The bad news, it took a world war for them to admit it. If you were poor in Edwardian London, standing still too long was a crime, not figuratively, literally. A man could be arrested for loitering with intent, though the intent part was rarely clear. Intent to what? Exist? Wait for someone? Breathe in the wrong borough? The Edwardians didn't need answers. They had suspicion, and that was enough. Standing still for too long counted as suspicious. Walking too fast probably did too. The great metropolis prided itself on progress, but progress came with policing. London at the turn of the 20th century was a city of contradictions, dazzling wealth beside desperate poverty, and morality perched uncomfortably atop misery. The Edwardian elite loved to talk about order, by which they meant keeping the poor, the idle, and the odd firmly in their place. To the upper classes, London streets were not public spaces, but stages for respectability. Anyone who didn't look like part of the performance risked being removed from the scene. The Metropolitan Police Act and Vagrancy Acts gave constables enormous discretion to detain anyone acting suspiciously. Suspiciousness, in Edwardian terms, included leaning against a wall, waiting for a friend, or, God forbid, existing without an obvious purpose. One magistrate famously defined loitering as standing in such a way as to attract unfavourable attention. By that standard, half of London's population was guilty every day before breakfast. The victims of this law were almost always the poor, the jobless, and anyone who looked like they might not afford clean boots. Police targeted street vendors, beggars, ex-soldiers, and young working-class men who had the audacity to exist outdoors after dusk. In poorer districts like Whitechapel and Suffolk, constables patrolled as if they were colonial officers in hostile territory. Their job was less about stopping crime and more about keeping poverty invisible. And then there were the unfortunates, the Edwardian euphemism for sex workers, who could be arrested for loitering with intent to solicit, even if no solicitation had occurred. The law's beauty, from the authorities' point of view, was its vagueness. If a woman stood under a lamppost too long, smiled at a passer-by, or simply had the wrong kind of confidence, that was enough for a charge. One officer testified that he arrested a woman because her posture was suggestive of immorality. Posture. Even your spine could be incriminating. But these arrests weren't just about morality, they were about control. London was swelling with the unemployed and underpaid. The working classes had begun to organise, forming unions and demanding rights. To a nervous establishment, crowds of idle men in public squares looked less like citizens and more like revolutionaries in waiting. The loitering laws became a convenient way to disperse gatherings before they turned political. After all, it's difficult to start a movement when standing still gets you hauled off by a constable. The police defended their actions as maintaining public decency and order, though it often looked more like harassment. Reports from the police news tell of men arrested for pausing outside shop windows without apparent purpose, or for sitting on a bench after dark in suspicious silence. In one recorded case, an out-of-work clerk was detained for loitering with an intent to commit a felony because he'd been standing near a bakery. When asked in court what crime he intended, the officer replied, "I could not say, but I did not like his attitude." Justice, apparently, was a matter of posture and vibes. The irony was painful. The same city that adored promenades, parks, and afternoon strolls made it illegal for the poor to linger. Leisure was a privilege, idleness a crime. The upper classes could linger in Hyde Park all day, sipping lemonade and pretending not to notice the smog. The working man sitting on a curb between shifts was a public nuisance. London's moral compass was calibrated by the price of your shoes. Even artists and court performers weren't safe. Street musicians, painters and sketchers were often charged with loitering when they couldn't afford official licenses. Imagine being fined for practicing your art because it made the pavement untidy. The creative class learned to keep moving, a slow waltz between inspiration and eviction. Of course, there were protests. Social reformers like George Bernard Shaw and Beatrice Webb denounced the vagrancy laws as cruelty disguised as civility. Newspapers sympathetic to the working poor ran editorials mocking the absurdity of arresting people for breathing too conspicuously. One cartoon showed a policeman chasing a man shouting, "Stop, you're under arrest for hesitation." Yet the laws persisted, bolstered by a public terrified of disorder. Sometimes the enforcement bordered on the surreal. In 1908, a man was arrested in Westminster for standing too attentively near Parliament. He turned out to be waiting for a job interview. In another case, 2 boys were detained for gazing idly at the Thames. The magistrate scolded them for encouraging idleness and fined their parents. It was as if the city itself wanted motion but no rest, life but no living. The truth was that Edwardian London ran on appearance. Respectability was everything. The poor, by virtue of existing visibly, broke the illusion of the empire's perfection. So the police did what governments always do when they can't solve poverty. They criminalised it. The loitering laws didn't stop crime, they stopped embarrassment. By the time World War I arrived, the absurdity had become impossible to ignore. Thousands of men once arrested for idleness were suddenly drafted into service and praised for standing still in trenches. The same society that had punished their poverty now depended on their endurance. After the war, reformers pushed for changes, and though the laws technically remained, public sympathy had shifted. Loitering no longer looked like rebellion, it looked like exhaustion. The good news, the Edwardians eventually learned that stillness isn't a crime. The bad news? Only after everyone who stood too long had already been moved along. Few objects in Edwardian London carried more social meaning, or risk of bodily harm, than the umbrella. It was the Swiss Army knife of civility. Protection from the weather, a walking stick, a pointer for directions, a fencing weapon in emergencies, and a subtle symbol of status. But in true Edwardian fashion, the nation that invented the phrase "keep a stiff upper lip" somehow decided that holding a stiff upper umbrella could be criminal. A gentleman's umbrella could defend against rain, rivals, and occasionally the law. By the early 1900s, London had earned its reputation as a city that never stopped raining but always stopped fun. Streets were narrow, crowds dense, and the number of umbrellas per square mile rivaled the number of actual raindrops. But not all umbrellas were created equal. A true Edwardian gentleman's brolly was not some flimsy contraption. It was a polished, straight-handled marvel, often made of whalebone or steel and wrapped in fabric heavy enough to repel both weather and commoners. Carrying one wasn't just practical, it was performance art. The trouble began when too many people joined the act. As the middle class expanded, so did umbrella ownership. Clerks, shopkeepers, and even women began brandishing them in public, transforming London streets into accidental fencing arenas. Collisions, jabs, and bruises became so common that newspapers reported a crisis of umbrella etiquette. One columnist in the Morning Post lamented, "Our pavements are no longer safe from impalement." Parliament, of course, took note, because nothing says imperial efficiency like regulating pointy objects during rush hour. Etiquette manuals leapt to the challenge. Pages were devoted to the proper carriage of umbrellas, with illustrations showing the correct angle to avoid decapitating passers-by. The Rules of London Politesse, 1903, even advised, "Never extend your umbrella as a sword, 'tis for defence not aggression," which strongly implied that someone, somewhere, had already tried. Violations of umbrella decorum were treated like social crimes. You could lose your reputation faster than your hat if you struck the wrong person with your spokes. And then came the actual laws. Several borough councils began issuing bylaws restricting the use of umbrellas in crowded thoroughfares. In Oxford Street, for instance, police were authorised to caution anyone carrying a pointed instrument in a careless or menacing fashion. In theory, this referred to umbrellas. In practice, it applied to anything longer than a sandwich. One particularly officious officer reportedly fined a man for reckless umbrella deployment, claiming he had brandished it at an alarming angle. The man's defence? It was raining diagonally. The absurdity didn't stop there. Umbrella behaviour in public parks became another battleground of civility. Hyde Park, where promenades were practically choreographed displays of elegance, instituted rules forbidding excessive twirling. Apparently, the rhythmic spinning of a parasol was considered dangerously flirtatious. In one note newspaper letter, an indignant woman complained that her twirl had been misinterpreted as an invitation to familiarity. London, it seemed, could handle empire, but not centrifugal force. The real fear behind the umbrella menace wasn't injury, it was disorder. The Edwardians loved hierarchy, and even umbrellas had class. A silk umbrella with a curved handle suggested refinement. A plain wooden one suggested you'd come from the suburbs. Men who forgot their umbrellas risked appearing untrustworthy. After all, what kind of gentleman couldn't anticipate the weather? But men who carried them too proudly were accused of swaggering. Somewhere between humility and hubris lay the correct umbrella posture, though no one ever found it. Umbrella duels, astonishingly, were a real phenomenon. Reports from the period describe altercations in which tempers and umbrellas flared. One notable 1906 incident involved two commuters at Charing Cross who began jabbing each other after a mutual splash from a passing cab. Both men ended up at the magistrate's court, where the judge remarked dryly, "It appears the umbrella is now the weapon of modern London." Cartoonists had a field day, depicting genteel Britons battling through rainstorms like knights in bowler hats. And then there was the great gender controversy. Women's umbrellas, or rather parasols, were lighter and daintier, often with ornate handles and lace trimming. But the growing popularity of practical rain umbrellas for women sparked panic among etiquette experts. "The lady with a large umbrella," warned one magazine, "forgets her femininity in her haste to remain dry." Apparently modesty and rainfall had to be negotiated separately. There were even complaints that women's umbrella tips were dangerous to the male eye, though it's unclear whether this referred to physical or social injury. Not all the concerns were imaginary. London's streets were congested nightmares. Carriages, omnibuses, cyclists and pedestrians all jostled for space under a cloud of drizzle. A sea of open umbrellas turned every intersection into a slapstick hazard. Trams got delayed as passengers struggled to collapse their dripping contraptions. Public signage even appeared at train stations. Umbrellas must be folded before boarding. The average Londoner spent more time battling at umbrellas than weather. Eventually humour won where legislation failed. Newspapers mocked umbrella rage stories and published satirical guides like The Gentle Art of Umbrella Diplomacy. Theatre sketches lampooned the self-importance of men who used umbrellas as moral batons. In one popular music hall song, the singer lamented, "My brolly's my pride, my protection, my friend, but heaven help those I impale at its end." The laughter worked. By poking fun at the absurdity, society learned to relax its death grip on propriety. By World War I, the umbrella's reputation had softened from menace to mild inconvenience. Practical folding models appeared, safer and easier to handle. The city moved on to bigger worries, shells instead of showers. But for a brief, delightful period, Edwardian London treated the umbrella as both symbol and threat, a statement of identity so sharp it required supervision. The good news: the umbrella survived the era's etiquette onslaught and became Britain's most loyal companion. The bad news: somewhere an Edwardian policeman is still watching, making sure you're holding it at the correct angle. There are few things as harmless as a swim on a hot day, unless of course you happen to be Edwardian. In that case, taking a dip was practically a criminal act. You could gamble, smoke and ride a train into the fog without anyone blinking, but wade into a river? Scandal. Apparently water was fine so long as you didn't actually touch it. The Edwardians inherited their bathing anxieties from the Victorians, who had turned modesty into an Olympic sport. Bathing was meant for health, not pleasure, and definitely not for display. But by the early 1900s, leisure swimming was creeping into fashion, thanks to seaside holidays and the growing popularity of public baths. Suddenly, thousands of ordinary Londoners were rediscovering that water wasn't just for washing, it was for fun, and that, according to moral reformers, was where civilization began to slip. The problem began with the rivers. London's waterways had once been industrial sewers, but as sanitation improved, people began treating them as playgrounds again. Boys leapt from bridges, men stripped to their drawers for a plunge, and daring young women, God help them, tried to join in. To officials, this was anarchy. To moralists, it was apocalypse in damp form. City bylaws soon appeared banning indecent exposure while bathing in public waters. The phrase was so vague it could mean anything from skinny dipping to splashing too enthusiastically. Some councils allowed bathing only before 8 a.m, provided swimmers wore suitable attire. What qualified as suitable was left to the imagination of the nearest constable, who, judging by reports, didn't have much of one. One man in 1904 was fined for bathing in improper costume, which turned out to be an ankle-length tunic. When he asked the magistrate what he should have worn, the reply was, less visibility, more morality. Public baths offered no escape. Built to promote hygiene among the working classes, they quickly became hotbeds of moral policing. Women's and men's sessions were strictly separated, with attendants patrolling to ensure no accidental eye contact occurred through the steam. In some cases, the two sides were divided by iron partitions that reached almost to the ceiling. The Edwardian motto seemed to be, cleanliness is next to godliness, but don't make it awkward. And then came the seaside. By the turn of the century, beaches were Britain's new obsession. Cheap trains and improved rail networks meant even the factory worker could afford a day at the shore. The result was chaos in corsets. Men and women began appearing on the same stretch of sand, scandalously alive, and worse, barely damp. Mixed bathing, see Chapter 3, was already controversial, but now even the water itself was under suspicion. The sea was too democratic, anyone could enter it. Moralists fretted that improper conduct might occur beneath the waves, as if the English Channel were hosting a nationwide flirtation. Municipalities tried to regulate the madness. Certain resorts built fences dividing men's and women's bathing zones. Others required bathing machines, wooden huts on wheels that allowed modest bathers to step directly into the sea without exposing an inch of skin. The machines would roll into the surf, doors closed, until the bather could descend a small ladder and immerse themselves privately, as God and society apparently intended. It was like swimming in a confessional booth. The absurdity didn't stop there. Some towns banned shouting, laughing, or undue frolic while in the water. It is unbecoming of a lady, one local ordinance declared, to display unrestrained joy. Another rulebook for public baths warned swimmers against horizontal lounging, which sounded sinful until you realised it referred to floating. Lifeguards were instructed to reprimand anyone assuming positions suggestive of relaxation. The Edwardians weren't fighting immorality so much as buoyancy, and of course the law hit the poor hardest. The upper classes could enjoy private swimming parties at country estates or spa towns, safely shielded from prying eyes and bylaws. But the working class, who used rivers, canals and public baths, were treated as ticking moral time bombs. Newspaper headlines blared "disgraceful scenes by the River Lee" and "bathers shock residents of Lambeth." The scenes in question usually involved boys splashing about while fully clothed. Gender made the hypocrisy complete. Men could strip to their waists and dive in without too much fuss. Women faced outrage for showing their ankles. One lady in 1906 was fined for bathing in view of the public while wearing a full bathing dress and stockings. The magistrate declared that her example might lead to imitation, which was precisely the problem. Respectability depended on women's discomfort. Pleasure was a privilege reserved for men, or no one at all. Behind the panic lay a familiar Edwardian fear, that joy was contagious. Swimming, like cycling or dancing, represented freedom, bodily, social, and psychological. It blurred the boundaries of class and gender, dissolving them as easily as salt in seawater. To the reformers, that was unacceptable, so they wrapped freedom in red tape, labelled it indecent, and called it moral progress. But as always, the people found loopholes. Early morning dawn swims became popular among those who wanted to avoid both crowds and constables. Secret swimming clubs appeared along the Thames, their members sneaking out at sunrise with towels and alibis. Some councils quietly stopped enforcing the stricter bans, deciding that perhaps drowning in modesty was less preferable than swimming without it. By the outbreak of World War I, the tide had literally turned. Mixed bathing became more common, public baths relaxed their rules, and beaches began to look less like segregated penitentiaries and more like playgrounds. The war's grim realities made earlier fears seem laughable. After seeing trenches, who cared about ankles? But for a brief bizarre chapter in Edwardian history, water itself became suspicious, an element that had to be enjoyed only under supervision, preferably while apologising. London had finally learned to clean itself up, but heaven forbid it got wet in public. The good news, the Edwardians rediscovered swimming as health, leisure and rebellion all at once. The bad news, they almost drowned in their own modesty first. If you wanted to scandalise Edwardian society, you didn't need to swear, steal or start a revolution. You just had to put on pants. In an age obsessed with propriety, the sight of a woman in trousers was enough to trigger mass fainting. The newspapers called it indecent, the clergy called it sinful, and Parliament, though it didn't quite know why, suspected it was subversive. Equality was fine in theory, as long as it wore a corset. The war on women's trousers began, ironically, in the name of practicality. The late Victorian and early Edwardian years saw women entering public life more than ever before. Cycling, working, protesting, even studying at universities. Yet their clothes remained the enemy. Layers of skirts, petticoats and corsets so tight they could make breathing optional. For women who wanted to move, the solution seemed obvious. Ditch the skirts, free the knees. Society, however, preferred its women immobilised. the rational dress movement emerged as an act of rebellion disguised as reform. Doctors began warning that corsets caused everything from fainting to organ misplacement, and activists like Lady Harberton and the Bloomer Society argued for looser, safer clothing. Their proposal divided skirts and bloomers, wide trouser-like garments that allowed women to walk, ride and cycle without risking spontaneous collapse. To modernise, they look harmless. To Edwardian critics, they looked like the end of civilization. The backlash was instant. Women in bloomers were heckled, mocked, and occasionally attacked in the street. Newspaper cartoons depicted them as hybrid creatures halfway between man and menace. Shopkeepers refused service to anyone dressed in the manner of an acrobat. The press called them rational monstrosities, because apparently the only thing worse than an irrational woman was one who dressed rationally. Even the law got involved. There was no explicit ban on trousers, but that didn't stop the police from improvising. Under vague indecency or disorderly conduct clauses, women could be detained for appearing in male attire. One 1905 report describes a woman arrested in Piccadilly for causing a disturbance by walking in men's breeches. The disturbance, of course, was everyone else's inability to handle the concept. Another woman, a teacher from Liverpool, was charged with masquerading as a man after cycling to work in bloomers. Her defence, that she was trying not to die of exhaustion, didn't sway the court. Behind the outrage lurked a deeper anxiety, the collapse of gender order. Trousers symbolised freedom, the kind that came with mobility, practicality and defiance. They erased the visual hierarchy that had long separated the sexes. If women could dress like men, what was next? Equal pay, voting? The Edwardians didn't know, but they weren't about to risk finding out. Fashion magazines did their best to calm the chaos. Trousered attire, they assured readers, is suitable only for private use or exceptional sport. Ladies could wear bloomers in the home, but heaven forbid they left the house dressed like a competent human being. Designers tried to soften the blow by feminising the look, adding lace, ribbons and enough ruffles to disguise the revolutionary subtext. The result looked like trousers that had lost their nerve. The suffragettes naturally saw through it. For them, clothing was political armour. Leaders like Emmeline Pankhurst and Annie Kenney wore tailored jackets and plain skirts, halfway between traditional femininity and the forbidden masculine. Some protesters even adopted bloomers during marches, arguing that if they were going to be manhandled by police, they might as well be dressed for it. The tabloids, missing the point as usual, called them mannish women and warned that political agitation was destroying womanly grace. But the idea spread. In artistic and intellectual circles, the new woman became both icon and insult, a figure of independence, intellect, and most dangerously, trousers. Playwrights mocked her, novelists celebrated her, and moralists accused her of everything from infertility to socialism. A satirical piece in Punch claimed the new woman would abandon her sewing for socialism and her skirts for scandal. The only thing they got right was the scandal. Working women, meanwhile, didn't have time for ideology. Factory labourers, street cleaners and delivery girls adopted practical trousers out of necessity, not rebellion. They wore men's cast-offs to protect themselves from soot, sparks and cold, though they risked arrest for doing so. The double standard was staggering. When a man rolled up his sleeves, he was industrious. When a woman rolled up her trousers, she was indecent. Even when trousers began sneaking into fashion through sportswear, riding breeches, knickerbockers and ski suits, they came with strict social disclaimers. A lady might wear them on horseback or a bicycle, but only under supervision, and preferably in a private field where no impressionable eyes could see. If she dared to stop for tea afterward, she was expected to change back into proper attire. The entire performance of womanhood was a costume change, and yet slowly the cracks widened. Designers like Paul Poiret in Paris began promoting Orientalist harem pants for women, still exotic but undeniably trousers. The fashion world gasped, then copied him. By the late 1910s, the war would finish what bloomers had started. With millions of men at the front, women filled factories, drove ambulances, and wore uniforms. Society suddenly discovered that trousers didn't dissolve femininity, they just made the workday easier. But in the Edwardian years before that revelation, trousers remained the most dangerous garment a woman could own, a piece of fabric capable of toppling decorum and unravelling gender itself. It was both armour and accusation, rebellion and ridicule, stitched together with equal parts courage and scandal. The good news: the Edwardians finally learned that trousers didn't destroy society. The bad news: it took a world war and a wardrobe malfunction to prove it. In Edwardian London, you could die whenever you pleased, so long as you had the decency to be buried during office hours. Death, like everything else in the empire, was subject to regulation. There were laws for where you could die, how fast your relatives were allowed to mourn, and most absurdly, when it was acceptable to hold your funeral. Because while life might be unpredictable, the Edwardians preferred their death neatly scheduled between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. You could die any time but not inconveniently. The obsession began, as so many things did, with respectability. By the early 1900s, Britain had turned burial into a matter of civic pride. Cemeteries were no longer gloomy churchyards. They were landscaped gardens of repose, complete with wrought iron fences, flower beds, and pathways for gentle morning walks. A proper funeral wasn't just about laying the dead to rest. It was about proving the living knew how to behave, and nothing was less respectable than a burial conducted after dark, which to the Edwardian imagination suggested chaos, secrecy, or, heaven forbid, poverty. The restrictions were built into municipal law. Many boroughs explicitly forbade funerals after sunset, citing safety concerns and the preservation of public decency. The official reasoning was that nighttime burials required extra staff, lighting and supervision, which the city couldn't afford. The unofficial reasoning was simpler. Nighttime was for sleeping, not sobbing. The middle classes, ever eager to draw moral lines, decided that anyone buried at night must be either disreputable or foreign. In a society that measured character by punctuality, even your corpse had to show up on time. The working poor, however, found this rule maddening. Most labourers couldn't afford to lose a day's wages to attend a daytime funeral, and burials after work hours were often their only option. Yet if they dared to arrange one, they risked reprimand or outright denial from the parish registrar. In some cases, police were sent to prevent unsanctioned evening interments. Picture it: a grieving family, coffin in hand, being politely informed that their loved one's appointment with eternity had to be rescheduled. The bureaucracy of death was a masterpiece of absurdity. Every burial required paperwork, permits, and timing coordination with the church, the cemetery, and the local health board. Late burials were viewed as suspicious, implying contagion or concealment. During outbreaks of disease, tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, officials sometimes imposed strict curfews on funerals altogether. The reasoning was that darkness made people careless, and careless mourners might accidentally turn a funeral into a public health hazard, because obviously grief was more infectious after dusk. And then there was the matter of lighting. Gas lamps, while common on city streets, were sparse in cemeteries. Officials fretted about accidents, open graves, uneven paths, and the general risk of mourners tripping into eternity ahead of schedule. There were also moral objections. Darkness, after all, was the natural ally of misbehaviour. One church newsletter warned that no good Christian business can occur by lantern light, as if funerals risked turning into late-night parties. The idea of burying Aunt Mildred under moonlight was apparently one candle away from paganism. Still, people tried. In working-class neighbourhoods like Limehouse and Poplar, families sometimes held half-illegal funerals at dusk, slipping quietly into cemeteries as the sun faded. Gravediggers, often sympathetic, would rush through the service by lantern glow, muttering prayers faster than a priest at last call. It wasn't rebellion, it was practicality. Death inconveniently didn't respect daylight savings. The middle and upper classes, of course, could buy their way out of the problem. Wealthier families arranged private nocturne burials with permission from bishops or local councils. These were often staged as grand candlelit spectacles, funerals by moonlight complete with choirs, torches, and orchestral laments. What was indecent for the poor was suddenly romantic for the rich. The hypocrisy was dazzling enough to illuminate half of London. Newspapers reported on these nighttime funerals with fascination, alternating between condemnation and envy. One 1909 article in the Daily Express described an extraordinary midnight interment, attended by ladies in veils, so dark one could not tell who wept. Another paper scolded that such ceremonies were continental affectations unfit for English soil, which was Edwardian code for "foreigners do it, so we mustn't." The clergy were torn. Some priests argued that death should be solemn, not scheduled, while others preferred the convenience of daylight burials that didn't interfere with dinner. A few radical vicars defied the ban entirely, insisting that God does not close heaven at 6 o'clock. They were often paid for their defiance with reprimands from their bishops, but won the admiration of the working poor, who dubbed them after-hours angels. What's fascinating is how these rules revealed the Edwardian soul, their obsession with appearances, their fear of disorder, and their deep discomfort with mortality itself. Death was inevitable, but how you died, and more importantly how you were buried, had to reflect your social rank. To be buried late was to be buried low. The night symbolised everything Edwardians wanted to control: emotion, spontaneity, and the unsettling reminder that beneath all their civility, everyone ends up in the same cold ground. Ironically, it was war that finally broke the habit. When the First World War arrived, death became too massive to manage politely. Graves were dug at all hours, funerals held by necessity rather than etiquette. The war stripped away the veneer of respectability and reminded the nation that death didn't keep office hours. By the 20s, the old bans quietly faded from law, relics of a time when grief itself required a permit. Still, the absurdity lingers. The Edwardians tried to civilise death, turning mourning into paperwork and eternity into a scheduling problem. They believed that if they kept the graveyards orderly enough, perhaps mortality itself would behave. The good news? The living finally learned to bury their dead whenever love or necessity demanded. The bad news? The paperwork probably still arrived late. Picture this. You're on holiday in Edwardian Brighton. The sea breeze is glorious, the sand slightly suspicious, and the air full of laughter and fried fish. You wander into a seaside shop to buy a souvenir, a jaunty postcard perhaps, to send back to London. On the rack you spot a cartoon, a portly gentleman ogling a bathing beauty while his wife glares. It's cheeky, harmless, funny. You scribble, "Wish you were here, though perhaps not in this swimsuit," and drop it in the post. A week later you find yourself the subject of an obscenity investigation. Welcome to the great Edwardian postcard panic, where one risque pun and your mail became evidence of moral decay. By the early 1900s, the postcard was Britain's favourite form of social media, a cheap, cheerful way to communicate across the empire without needing penmanship or postage guilt. A penny would send your message anywhere. Millions were mailed daily, family greeting, seaside jokes, scenic views, and, increasingly, a type of humour the Edwardians called saucy. These cards were the meme culture of their day, cheeky, quick, and occasionally scandalous, and predictably, they horrified the moral guardians of the realm. It all began innocently enough. Advances in printing made colourful lithographs cheap to produce, and tourist towns along the coasts, Blackpool, Margate, Brighton, churned them out like candy. But the humour grew progressively bolder. There were jokes about bathing costumes, about flirtatious maids and bumbling husbands, about beer, corsets, and courtship. Some featured women showing, brace yourself, calves. Others dared to joke about marriage in ways that suggested it wasn't always blissful. In short, postcards began reflecting real life, and that was the problem. To Edwardian reformers, These images represented the decline of civilization one giggle at a time. Newspapers thundered that indecent postcards were corrupting the young, especially women and the impressionable classes. The post office, then a proud arm of the government, was accused of trafficking filth through Her Majesty's mailbags. Moral crusaders flooded Parliament with letters demanding action. One MP dramatically declared that the penny post has become the pipeline of impurity. He probably needed a holiday himself. Soon local police began raiding postcard shops. Vendors were arrested, their wares confiscated as evidence. In 1908 alone, more than 5,000 indecent postcards were seized in London. Entire print runs were burned in bonfires of righteousness. Shopkeepers defended themselves with weary good humour. They are only jokes, but the magistrates weren't laughing. One judge declared that the British sense of humour must remain within moral boundaries, which is perhaps the most British sentence ever uttered. What counted as obscene was gloriously inconsistent. A postcard showing a woman's ankle? Banned. A pun about bathing? Banned. A cartoon of a husband hiding in a wardrobe? Outrageous. Yet postcards showing drunk men, gluttony, or general buffoonery were fine. Apparently moral danger only struck when anyone seemed to enjoy sex or sunshine. The censor's favourite excuse was the Obscene Publications Act, a legal catch-all that allowed authorities to seize anything that tended to deprave or corrupt, which in Edwardian practice meant anything that makes us blush. Ironically, this moral crusade only made the postcards more popular. People love forbidden fruit, especially when it's printed in colour and costs a penny. The banned cards became collector's items, traded secretly among friends or sold under the counter. Tourists asked slyly for the good ones, prompting shopkeepers to wink and fetch the hidden stock. Entire industries sprung up around smuggling saucy postcards past inspectors, often by disguising them as scenic landscapes on the outside and in, with the real image printed beneath a peel-away layer. Edwardians may have repressed emotions, but they were innovative about loopholes. Artists became unlikely celebrities in this underground world. Donald McGill, the king of naughty postcards, churned out thousands of designs filled with double entendres, cheeky wordplay, and winking seaside humour. His cards were tame by modern standards. Plump matrons on holiday, bumbling husbands, flirtatious young women with parasols, but they captured the spirit of the age, a population desperate to laugh at its own stiffness. McGill was adored by the public and loathed by moralists. In 1909, his publishers were raided and fined. One critic called his work the handwriting of depravity. Another, more accurate, called it very funny. But the postcard scandal wasn't really about pictures, it was about control. The Edwardians were living through a social earthquake. Industrialisation, women's suffrage, labour unrest, new technologies. The old guard feared that laughter was eroding authority. If people could joke about love, class and marriage, what else might they stop taking seriously? The humble postcard became a scapegoat for every anxiety about modernity. Censorship, in its own absurd way, was a desperate attempt to keep Britain's sense of humour under lock and key. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was laughing at Britain's prudishness. French and German postcards were far bolder, often featuring fully nude figures under the guise of artistic studies. The French, ever pragmatic, saw no reason why a bare shoulder should end civilization. British censors, however, imported these cards just to confiscate them. Somewhere in a dusty government archive, boxes of forbidden postcards sat stacked like trophies of moral victory. One imagines the inspectors sneaking peeks during lunch breaks, muttering purely for research. By the eve of World War I, the moral storm began to fade. The war drowned out trivial scandal, and the humour that once seemed indecent began to feel innocent. Soldiers sent cheeky postcards from the front filled with jokes about mud, rations, and the occasional pin-up drawing. No one dared to censor them. The men in the trenches had earned the right to wink at the absurdity of life. After the war, saucy Seaside cards made a triumphant return. Less scandalous, more nostalgic, forever linked to Britain's national pastime. laughing at itself. The great postcard panic now seems almost charming, a reminder that the Edwardians lived perpetually on the edge of outrage, terrified that laughter might loosen their moral corsets. They wanted a nation of good manners and bad puns, but not too bad. The good news, the Edwardians finally realised humour was cheaper than repression and twice as effective. The bad news, it took a postcard to teach them that joy wasn't evidence. Ah, the Edwardian Park, a lush green slice of civility carved out of London's choking fog. On paper, it was a paradise of fresh air, sunlight, and moral rejuvenation. In practice, it was a minefield of regulations. These were not places for fun, they were places for appropriate repose. You could stroll briskly but not eagerly, admire the ducks silently, and perhaps sit if your posture radiated restraint. Anything beyond that, and you risked a lecture or an arrest. If you so much as breathed suggestively near a shrub, a constable appeared. At the turn of the 20th century, London's parks were both its lungs and its laboratory for social control. The Victorians had built them to uplift the masses, a noble idea based on the belief that trees improved morals, but by Edwardian times, reformers had decided that uplift worked best when accompanied by strict supervision. Park regulations multiplied until relaxation itself became an administrative category. Every signpost seemed to begin with, "It is forbidden." Forbidden to shout, forbidden to run, forbidden to lie on the grass. Forbidden at one point to make any display of merriment inconsistent with the dignity of the park. The rules read like satire. You could not play ball games outside of designated areas, which were usually imaginary. You could not feed animals, unless you were a title lady holding a handful of breadcrumbs, then it was considered picturesque. Singing required a special permit. So did preaching, political speaking, or whistling too enthusiastically. Dogs had to be leashed, muzzled, and morally upright. One pamphlet from 1907 advised owners that frolicsome behaviour from their pets might result in removal from the grounds. Imagine explaining to your terrier that he was under arrest for joy. Most notorious of all was the rule against lying down. Park superintendents viewed horizontal citizens with deep suspicion. Lying on the grass suggested idleness, and idleness led to immorality, which led, naturally, to the downfall of the empire. Men who dared to nap in the shade were accused of vagrancy. Women who reclined even modestly risked being labelled improper. Police reports from Hyde Park record actual arrests for lying prone without medical justification. You could sit and sigh about life, but you couldn't do it horizontally. And heaven help you if you fell in love. Hand-holding, hugging, or even prolonged smiling between couples was considered conduct unbecoming. Park constables, armed with whistles and moral authority, patrolled the lawns like gardeners of virtue. Their main task, to prevent unlicensed affection. Lovers were scolded, fined, or separated for the preservation of public decency. A kiss under a willow tree could spark a small scandal. The Edwardians were romantics in theory, but in practice they preferred romance conducted under official supervision, ideally through the postal service with a stamp of approval. Children, too, were under surveillance. Games like hoop rolling, kite flying, and even skipping were restricted in certain parks because they disturbed the peaceful enjoyment of respectable citizens. One superintendent of Regent's Park reportedly banned skipping ropes after an incident in which a child's laughter startled a swan. The birds, it seemed, were granted more rights to serenity than the humans. And then there was the class dimension, always the unspoken rule behind the rules. Upper-class visitors could picnic, sketch, or bring along small orchestras for impromptu recitals, and the constables turned a blind eye. But when working-class families attempted the same, it was public disorder. Picnics involving cheap beer or loud laughter were treated as mob behaviour. To be poor in an Edwardian park was to be perpetually on parole. Even sitting too long could earn you suspicion, because as one official put it, the industrious do not linger. The absurdity reached peak bureaucracy with official park licences. Vendors selling balloons or postcards needed multiple stamps of approval. Musicians had to perform only in authorised zones and maintain temperate rhythms. An accordionist in Victoria Park was once fined for producing an unregulated volume. Another poor man was reprimanded for dancing to his own accompaniment. The authorities didn't hate music, they just preferred it muffled, polite, and preferably performed indoors by someone named Sir. Public protests occasionally turned these over-manicured gardens into battlegrounds of principle. In 1906, a group of social reformers staged what the papers later dubbed the Reclining Rebellion. They deliberately lay down in Hyde Park in an act of civil disobedience against the no lying on the grass rule. The constables, flustered by the sheer audacity of horizontal protest, tried to drag them upright, which only made the whole thing look like a badly choreographed dance. Crowds gathered. Someone started singing Rule Britannia. The park board was mortified. The next week, the rule was quietly reconsidered, though enforcement continued whenever anyone looked too comfortable. And of course the great unmentionable, the shrubbery. Park administrators feared inappropriate behaviour in the bushes with the intensity of a Victorian poet fearing passion. Couples caught wandering into the greenery after dusk were accused of indecent loitering. The Morning Chronicle even warned readers about the hidden dangers of hedgerows. The parks may have been public, but privacy within them was treated as a moral emergency. Beneath all this fussing was the Edwardian obsession with control. Parks weren't just green spaces, they were moral laboratories, meant to demonstrate that civilization could tame even nature. Grass was to be trimmed, ducks disciplined, and people politely prevented from behaving like living organisms. The ideal park-goer was silent, upright, and dressed as if attending a minor royal funeral. Yet despite the rules, or perhaps because of them, the parks remained full. Londoners needed escape from the city's grime, even if it came with a side of supervision. Families picnicked anyway. Lovers risked the whistle. Street musicians played just below the legal decibel limit. Laughter, like dandelions, always found a way to grow through the cracks of decorum. By the time World War I erupted, the park's fussy tranquillity gave way to something far grimmer. Soldiers drilled where children once played, and temporary hospitals replaced manicured lawns. The old rules faded into irrelevance. Nobody cared about proper posture when the nation itself was horizontal with exhaustion. After the war, the surviving Londoners returned to their parks and, perhaps out of gratitude, relaxed the rules. It turned out lying down wasn't the end of civilization after all. The good news: the Edwardians eventually allowed Londoners to enjoy their parks like human beings. The bad news? They still wrote signs reminding everyone not to forget their manners while doing it. If there was one thing the Edwardians hated more than indecency, it was unregulated joy. And nothing embodied joy, loud, bright, uncontrollable joy, like fireworks. To modernise, fireworks are harmless entertainment, a bit of sparkle, a bang, a reason to say ooh, but to Edwardian lawmakers, they were chaos in stick form, capable of igniting not just rooftops but the moral fibre of the empire itself. Explosions were fine if you were expanding the empire, not if you were celebrating your birthday. At the dawn of the 20th century, fireworks were everywhere and nowhere at once. They had been a part of British life since the Tudors, used to celebrate coronations, royal weddings, and victories over whichever country Britain had most recently defeated. But as the Edwardians inherited this tradition, they decided the working classes were getting too fond of it. Fireworks, they argued, were dignified when set off by the crown, and dangerous when lit by the common man, which coincidentally was how they felt about almost everything. The problem was partly practical. London's houses were packed shoulder to shoulder, and most were still lit by gas lamps or candles, essentially turning the city into one enormous tinderbox. Every year, firework accidents made the headlines: singed curtains, exploded sheds, eyebrows lost in the name of patriotism. So in 1875, the Explosives Act was passed, regulating everything from gunpowder storage to the sale of sparklers. By the Edwardian period, those restrictions had metastasized into a full-blown licensing system. You needed government permission to buy, sell, or even store fireworks. Lighting one in public without authorization could result in a fine or a very pointed lecture about the preservation of tranquility. But of course, that only made people want them more. Bonfire Night, Guy Fawkes Day, remained the annual outbreak of anarchy that officials dreaded. Theoretically, it commemorated the saving of Parliament from Catholic conspirators. In practice, it was a nationwide excuse to set things on fire. Children ran through the streets with crude effigies shouting "penny for the guy" before spending the proceeds on small explosives known as squibs. Working-class neighbourhoods lit bonfires big enough to roast entire reputations. It was loud, smoky, chaotic, and deeply un-British by Edwardian standards, which is to say, it was fun. Authorities began clamping down. In London, constables patrolled the streets on the 5th of November armed with buckets of water and disapproval. Private displays were discouraged, then banned outright in some boroughs. Shopkeepers selling fireworks without a licence faced prosecution. By 1908, even sparklers required official registration under the Petroleum Act, because anything that glowed, fizzed or delighted children was clearly suspect. Councils began hosting their own approved firework shows, short, dignified, and safely dull. One report from Battersea described an official display lasting precisely 12 minutes, and ending with polite applause. It was, according to the organisers, a triumph of safety over spectacle. Meanwhile, the moralists entered the chat. Newspapers and temperance leagues argued that fireworks encouraged riotous celebration and disorderly gatherings. A reverend in Chelsea called them a heathen indulgence in elemental excitement. Translation: people looked too happy. Some even warned that fireworks could lead to moral laxity, because apparently watching sparks fly might make other things ignite. One pamphlet declared, "Where the eyes are delighted by light, the conscience is dimmed." You have to admire the poetic pessimism. Children naturally ignored all of this. They built their own black market firework economy, pooling pennies to buy illegal squibs from sympathetic shopkeepers or smugglers who operated out of railway yards. Boys' magazines like Chums and the Boys' Own Paper occasionally printed articles about homemade pyrotechnics, which were later banned for encouraging delinquency. Every November, London became a patchwork of secret bangs and forbidden sparkles, a miniature rebellion against the tyranny of bedtime. Even adult enthusiasts found ways around the law. Some hosted private pyrotechnic soirees in gardens or meadows under the guise of scientific demonstration. Guests dressed formally, sipped tea and applauded, while rockets soared because nothing says rebellion like polite applause. A few ambitious souls took things further. In 1909, a wealthy eccentric named Sir Felix Crossley attempted to launch a firework salute from his roof in Kensington to celebrate his daughter's engagement. It ended with the local fire brigade rescuing guests from a flaming conservatory. The newspapers dubbed it the Engagement Inferno, and Crossley was fined for reckless exhibition of enthusiasm. The irony, as always, was that the upper classes continued to enjoy massive, extravagant firework displays for royal anniversaries and military victories. When Edward VII recovered from illness in 1902, fireworks lit up the Thames for miles, by order of the same government that fined butchers' sons for lighting a Roman candle. The difference was simple. One explosion celebrated authority, the other independence. The Edwardians preferred their fireworks hierarchical. Still, public affection for pyrotechnics refused to die. Even as restrictions tightened, fireworks became symbols of defiance and delight. They appeared in postcards, children's books, and even advertisements for tooth powder. "Sparkle safely," one ad urged, with unintended irony. People lit them in backyards, alleyways, and open fields, risking fines for the sake of one brief, beautiful burst of rebellion. Then came the war, and with it, a new reason to ban fireworks. Explosions were no longer festive, they were reminders of artillery. By 1915, the government prohibited all civilian displays to prevent confusion during air raids. The night sky that once glimmered with celebration became a place of fear. When peace finally returned, fireworks crept back cautiously but never quite lost their Edwardian baggage. Looking back, the firework panic was less about safety than about symbolism. Fireworks represented spontaneity, excitement, and the kind of uncontrolled energy that made the Edwardian establishment sweat. They were miniature revolutions, loud, bright, and impossible to schedule between tea and supper. The good news? Britain eventually decided that small explosions were good for morale. The bad news? It still took a permit, a warning sign, and a constable with a bucket to prove it. The Edwardians lived in an age when coal smoke filled the sky, trains belched steam, and London's air looked like a permanent fog of progress. And yet somehow the real threat, according to moral reformers, was one woman holding a cigarette. Men could smoke like factories, but one lady with a cigarette was a moral inferno. By 1900, Britain was fully addicted to tobacco. Cigars were the mark of power, pipes the emblem of tradition, and cigarettes, cheap, portable, and modern, were the latest craze. Soldiers smoked them, clerks smoked them, even teenage boys practiced looking contemplative in alleyways with hand-rolled contraband. Tobacco had become the great social equalizer, a rare pleasure that crossed class lines. And that naturally made it suspicious. When everyone could do it, reformers felt it was time to stop everyone from doing it. The early anti-smoking campaigns began with good intentions and bad data. Doctors warned that cigarettes weakened the constitution, corrupted the blood, and, in one particularly creative theory, caused intellectual decline through fumes entering the brain via the nose. But their medical warnings were quickly hijacked by moral ones. Smoking, it was said, encouraged idleness, disrespect, and vanity, which is Edwardian for fun. Campaigners insisted it led youths toward gambling, crime, and somehow jazz, which hadn't even arrived yet. The Society for the Suppression of Juvenile Smoking was founded in 1906, declaring that cigarettes were the devil's bait for boyhood. Pamphlets depicted children puffing away and transforming into hooligans before your very eyes. Newspapers printed cautionary tales of boys who started with tobacco and ended with prison. Schoolmasters began searching pockets for rolling papers as if they were weapons. In some towns, lighting a cigarette under the age of 16 could get you hauled before a magistrate. But the real scandal was when women joined in. The sight of a woman smoking in public sent Edwardian society into an apocalyptic spiral. The cigarette was not just a stick of tobacco, it was a social grenade. To many it symbolized independence, rebellion, and worst of all, pleasure without permission. A woman with a cigarette wasn't just enjoying herself, she was rewriting the social contract. And the establishment did not approve of unauthorized literature. In 1908, London witnessed one of the first moral panics of the modern age, the cigarette girl crisis. It began when a group of bohemian actresses and suffragettes were photographed smoking outside a theatre. The tabloids lost their collective mind. One headline read, "Women imitate men's vices, London's morals in peril." Clergymen thundered from pulpits that smoking women were destroying the sweetness of feminine nature. Even doctors chimed in, claiming tobacco would wither the complexion and harden the heart, because heaven forbid a woman look worldly and satisfied. Restaurants, hotels, and clubs began posting signs, "No smoking permitted for ladies." The rule was clear. Men could exhale empire, but women must inhale decorum. A lady lighting up in public was liable to be ejected, fined, or more often publicly humiliated. One notorious case in 1909 saw a woman refuse service at the Savoy Hotel for attempting to smoke in mixed company. She calmly lit her cigarette anyway, declared, "Then I shall dine with myself," and walked out. The newspapers dubbed her the Empress of Smoke, which she probably considered a promotion. Ironically, the Edwardians themselves had popularised cigarettes in the first place. During the Boer War, soldiers returned home with the habit, calling it a comfort in the field. The government had even distributed tobacco rations as morale boosters. But peace made pleasure dangerous again. Tobacco companies, sensing controversy, doubled down with advertising. Posters showed elegant women with cigarettes, modern, confident, unchaperoned. The slogan might as well have read, "Try rebellion in a box of 20. For the guardians of morality, this was war. The National League for Clean Living declared cigarettes a direct threat to the moral hygiene of the nation. Anti-smoking lecturers toured schools and women's clubs, waving jars filled with tar scraped from the lungs of imaginary victims. A popular pamphlet titled The Ashes of Womanhood warned that smoking would not only ruin a lady's complexion, but destroy her maternal instincts. One wonders how the writer imagined evolution working, that the first puff turned you into a cactus. Meanwhile, women were too busy enjoying themselves to care. Smoking rooms began appearing in private salons and avant-garde cafes. Artists, writers, and suffragettes adopted the cigarette as a symbol of self-possession. Virginia Woolf later described it as the badge of thought. In the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury, lighting up became an act of defiance, a quiet, elegant no to a society that treated women's lungs as moral property. But while the middle classes smoked in secret, the poor paid the price in public. Working-class girls who smoked were labelled roughs, shorthand for every social ill imaginable. Magistrates fined mothers for setting a bad example if seen with a cigarette near their children. Tobacco was cheap, but respectability was expensive, and few could afford both. The divide grew so stark that newspapers joked, "You can tell a lady by whether she smokes before or after being married." By the late Edwardian period, the tide began to shift, not because reformers won, but because hypocrisy caught up with them. The same MPs who railed against women smoking were photographed puffing away beside actresses at racecourses. Cigarettes became too profitable to moralise about forever. The First World War finally shattered the taboo. Tobacco was again handed out freely to soldiers, and women working in munitions factories began smoking on breaks. When the men returned, they found the world had changed, and half the nation now shared their habit. In hindsight, the cigarette scare says less about health and more about control. It wasn't about smoke, it was about who got to exhale. For Edwardian men, smoking was a symbol of composure and authority. For women, it was rebellion disguised as recreation. Every puff was a statement. I exist on my own terms. The good news, the cigarette became a spark for social change long before anyone realised the irony. The bad news, the Edwardians were too busy panicking about lips on fire to notice the world itself was about to ignite. Few things frightened Edwardian Britain quite like the supernatural, unless of course it came with an admission fee. The early 900s were an age of paradox. Electric lights flickered beside gas lamps. Motorcars shared the road with horses, and rationality strutted about in a top hat pretending it had finally conquered superstition. Yet under all that modern polish, the British public still craved whispers from the beyond. Seances, mediums, crystal gazers and palm readers thrived from Kensington parlours to East End backrooms, and that naturally made the government panic. Predicting the future was illegal, unless you were the Prime Minister doing it badly. The crackdown began with the Vagrancy Act of 1824, an ancient piece of legislation dusted off for a new century. It allowed authorities to prosecute persons pretending to tell fortunes as rogues and vagabonds. What began as a way to punish wandering tricksters evolved into a full-scale campaign against anyone with a deck of tarot cards and an audience. To Edwardian lawmakers, fortune-telling wasn't a harmless diversion, it was fraud wrapped in incense. A spiritualist could be fined, imprisoned, or publicly ridiculed for deceiving the public by pretended powers of prophecy. Ironically, that was also a pretty good job description for most politicians. By the 1900s, Britain was in the grip of spiritualism, a movement born out of grief and curiosity. After the trauma of the Boer War and the constant drumbeat of modern anxiety, people wanted reassurance that death wasn't quite as final as the obituaries suggested. Parlours across London hosted séances where respectable widows held hands with sceptical scientists and waited for tables to knock. Mediums claimed to channel lost husbands, soldiers, and even dogs. One popular psychic promised messages from beloved pets properly translated. But while believers found comfort, skeptics, and more importantly the police, found opportunity. Authorities saw a perfect target, the intersection of gullibility, emotion, and profit. Mediums were easy to catch because their crimes were performed in front of witnesses. Undercover officers attended seances disguised as grieving relatives, only to leap up mid-ghostly moan shouting, "You're under arrest for communing without a license." The spectacle was absurd. In one case from 1906, a clairvoyant named Madame Winette was arrested after allegedly summoning the spirit of a man's deceased aunt. The séance ended when the aunt knocked 3 times on the table. Unfortunately, the table also concealed a police officer. But not all accused fortune-tellers were flamboyant frauds. Many were small-time practitioners, especially women, who used palmistry or card reading as a side income in a society that gave them few legal ways to earn. They worked in market stalls, fairs, and tenement kitchens, charging a penny or two for a glimpse of destiny. To their customers, they were confidants and counsellors, cheap therapy before psychology became fashionable. Yet to the authorities, they were parasites upon credulity. Police reports described them as dangerous to impressionable minds, which was Edwardian code for "they're popular among women." The class hypocrisy was staggering. While humble palm readers faced raids and fines, fashionable psychical researchers in Mayfair hosted séances complete with society guests, fine china and champagne. Scientists debated the ectoplasmic phenomenon while wearing tuxedos. Newspapers reported their findings respectfully, until the same week they ran the stories about East End fortune-tellers being dragged into court. Evidently, spiritual insight was acceptable so long as it wore pearls. The press played both sides beautifully. Papers like the Daily Mail mocked mediums one day and published their predictions the next. Headlines alternated between society ladies fooled by phantom voices and noted seer foretells reign at the coronation. Even the police couldn't resist the irony. One magistrate in 1908 remarked, "If these women truly saw the future, they'd have known I was about to find them." Behind the laughter, however, there was genuine fear. The Edwardians were obsessed with order and truth, 2 things spiritualism blurred. The idea that unseen forces could influence people terrified an establishment already nervous about social change. Fortune-tellers gave power to the powerless. Working-class women, widows, the lonely, the curious. They offered comfort outside church walls and answers outside Parliament. To control-minded officials, that was practically sedition. Still, the demand only grew. As the city modernised, so did the mystics. Palmistry manuals sold in railway kiosks beside novels and cigarettes. Mediums advertised discreetly in classified ads. Your future revealed in confidence. Strictly scientific. Some fortune-tellers disguised their services as character readings, emphasising the psychological rather than the supernatural, an early rebranding exercise to dodge the law. It worked about half the time. And yet, even amid the police raids and mockery, there were believers in high places. Queen Victoria herself had dabbled in séances decades earlier, setting a royal precedent that no one wanted to mention but everyone remembered. By Edwardian times, members of the aristocracy still held private sittings, though they called them experimental evenings. Newspapers pretended not to notice when duchesses claimed to have received interior decorating tips from the late Prince Albert. The real turning point came with World War I. As Britain drowned in grief, the public's hunger for contact with the dead became ungovernable. Spiritualism exploded once again, quite literally in some séance rooms where candles met drapery, and the government finally gave up trying to police it. But during the Edwardian years, the state had treated belief itself as a misdemeanour, as if faith required a permit. Looking back, the campaign against fortune-tellers wasn't really about fraud. It was about fear, of deception, of emotion, of people finding hope outside official channels. The Edwardians trusted telegrams over tarot, bureaucracy over belief. Yet despite all their progress, they never managed to legislate away curiosity. Every time a fortune-teller's cards were confiscated, another appeared down the street, promising insight for a penny and secrecy for free. The good news? The Edwardians finally realised you can't outlaw the human need to hope. The bad news? They still fined people for predicting rain without a meteorology licence. In Edwardian London, loyalty was everything, especially if it came with paperwork. You could love your dog, feed it, and let it sleep at the foot of your bed. But if you didn't have the proper licence, you were basically committing treason against bureaucracy. Nothing captured the spirit of Edwardian regulation better than their attitude toward pets. Affection was permitted, so long as it was filed, stamped, and wearing the correct identification. The story begins with the Dogs Act of 1871, a piece of legislation designed to control dangerous and stray dogs. In theory, it was about public safety. In practice, it was about control and revenue. By the Edwardian era, owning a dog without a licence was not just frowned upon, it was a punishable offence. Every canine required an official brass tag attached to a collar, proof that its owner had paid the annual fee, 7 shillings and sixpence, a tidy sum for working-class Londoners. Without that shining symbol of state approval, your beloved mutt could be seized, fined, or in bureaucratic terms, disposed of. Dog licensing quickly became one of the most absurd examples of Edwardian red tape. The authorities claimed it was to ensure responsible ownership and fund the prevention of rabies. But everyone knew the real goal was paperwork, Britain's unofficial national religion. Inspectors prowled neighbourhoods like bounty hunters, peering into yards and alleyways in search of unlicensed wagging tails. Notices were plastered on lampposts warning, "Unlicensed dogs will be destroyed." It sounded less like a civic reminder and more like a threat from a dystopian empire of clerks. For the poor, the law was cruel. A working man might keep a dog not as luxury but as protection, companionship, or pest control. But paying the fee was often impossible. Many tried to dodge it by crafting makeshift tags or, ingeniously, carving fake license numbers into bits of tin. Others taught their dogs to disappear at the sight of a constable. The term collar dodger briefly entered slang, referring to both dogs and their financially creative owners. Unfortunately, the law wasn't amused. Entire kennels of unlicensed dogs were rounded up by the animal wardens, who often doubled as moral crusaders. The authorities framed their campaign in terms of hygiene and order. Stray dogs, they insisted, carried disease and disrupted the neatness of urban life. The city's growing obsession with public health had extended from humans to hounds, though the compassion was strictly conditional. Official reports described undesirable canines wandering without restraint, as if the dogs were revolutionary pamphleteers plotting sedition. To the Edwardian bureaucrat, a leash wasn't a symbol of care, it was civilization itself. Of course, class decided everything. Aristocrats kept their pedigreed hounds in velvet kennels and paraded them through Hyde Park like living accessories. Their animals were always licensed, bathed, perfumed, and occasionally insured. Working-class dogs, meanwhile, were lucky if they escaped being labelled strays by overzealous inspectors. One newspaper in 1905 reported a case in which a constable confiscated a labourer's dog while it was asleep on his doorstep. The charge? Being at large without supervision. The man protested that his dog had never left the premises. The magistrate replied, "The law does not concern itself with sentiment." It rarely did. The dog tax became such a public irritant that it inspired genuine acts of rebellion. In some towns, owners held mock funerals for their pets to protest the fees, marching empty leashes through the streets while children sang parodies of patriotic songs. Rule, Britannia! Britannia pays the fee! Others resorted to deception. One clever Londoner was caught painting fake tags on his dog's collars with gold ink. When asked to explain himself, he said, "If they can't read, they can't fine." Yet amid the bureaucracy, Edwardians adored their pets. Dog ownership cut across class lines, and London streets echoed with barking companions, terriers chasing rats, spaniels trotting beside carriages, mutts guarding markets. Newspapers ran columns of lost and found dogs longer than political debates. Animal welfare organisations like the RSPCA grew rapidly during this era, campaigning against cruelty and improving shelter conditions. The irony was thick. While reformers fought to save strays, the state was busy rounding them up in the name of order. And let's not forget the cats. Technically, cats didn't require licences, a fact that scandalised many officials who saw it as an affront to fairness. One member of Parliament even proposed a feline registry to bring all domestic animals under equal civic duty. The motion was laughed out of session, but not before someone suggested a national collar for every creature scheme. It never passed, possibly because someone realised that enforcing a cat tax would lead to revolution. The crackdown on strays went hand in paw with the Edwardian passion for classification. The empire catalogued everything: minerals, colonies, diseases, and now pets. To have an unregistered dog was to exist outside the system, and that made people nervous. Even sentimental Victorians had viewed dogs as moral mirrors of their owners. If your dog was disobedient or scruffy, so perhaps were you. In Edwardian eyes, a licensed dog was not just legal, it was respectable. It wore its tag like a little medal of conformity, but the most tragic casualties were the strays. London's dog catchers roamed with nets, hauling in the unclaimed and uncollared. They were taken to municipal dog depots, where owners had a few days to pay fines before their pets were euthanized. Newspapers occasionally published heart-wrenching sketches of children begging to save their dogs. The public grumbled, but bureaucracy marched on. Nothing could halt the empire of forms and fees. The outbreak of World War I, however, changed everything. Suddenly, the government had bigger concerns than unlicensed terriers. Dogs were enlisted for service as messengers, guards, and mascots. The once suspect mongrel became a national hero, licensing laws loosened, and patriotism replaced paperwork. For a brief, glorious moment, loyalty mattered more than ledgers. Still, the episode remains pure Edwardian poetry. A society so enamoured with the order, it managed to turn pet ownership into a civic trial. To love an animal was fine, as long as you could prove it to the Treasury. The good news, the Edwardians made dogs the most law-abiding citizens in London. The bad news, they probably made them fill out forms in triplicate. If one could bottle Edwardian anxiety, it would probably come with a label reading, "For external use only. Apply liberally to all aspects of public life. Side effects may include repression, red tape, and moral superiority." The early 20th century was an age straddling two worlds, half steam engine, half telephone line, half empire, half nervous breakdown. The Edwardians inherited Victorian morality but lived in a rapidly modernising society that terrified them. Their solution? Rules. More rules. Infinite rules. Edwardians feared the future so much they tried to outlaw it. Every decade of history invents new fears. For the Edwardians, progress itself was the monster under the bed. The world was spinning faster than their top hats could keep up. Electricity, cars, women's suffrage, jazz, or whatever scandalous rhythm preceded it. London had become a city of contrasts, glittering electric lights above, grinding poverty below, and the genteel classes clung to order the way a drowning man clings to etiquette. Every new invention, behaviour, or pleasure needed a law, a licence, or at least a stern letter to the times. Behind all these bans, the noisy music, the flirtatious postcards, the public kissing, the trousers, the fireworks, and even the dogs without collars, was one great Edwardian illusion, that civilization could be preserved by paperwork. They genuinely believed the empire might crumble, not under military defeat, but under the weight of laughter, affection, or an uncovered ankle. Morality became administration. Policemen carried notebooks full of decency violations. Local councils drafted bylaws about how joy should be conducted. A society that had conquered continents was now terrified of its own citizens having fun without permission. To understand their obsession, you must imagine the mood. It was an age of glitter and dread. The old order, the rigid hierarchy of class, gender and empire, was wobbling. The middle class was expanding, the working class was demanding rights. Women were marching for votes. Technology was erasing distance faster than manners could compensate. The Edwardian ruling class sensed their world slipping and responded the only way they knew how, by tightening the corset of civilization another notch. It wasn't all villainy, of course. Some restrictions were born from genuine attempts to solve chaos, disease control, industrial safety, or public order. London was overcrowded, filthy, and often dangerous. But somewhere between good intentions and government ink, the moral compass spun off its axis. The line between public safety and personal suffocation vanished under the weight of bureaucracy. The authorities treated behaviour itself as a contagion. Every smile, skirt and sparkler a possible outbreak of social decline. And yet the people resisted in small, beautiful ways. The street performers who played under threat of fines, the couples who kissed in parks despite watchful constables, the suffragettes who wore bloomers and smoked in public just to see who would faint first, the children who set off illegal fireworks behind bakeries, the fortune-tellers who kept reading palms after midnight raids. Every act of defiance, no matter how petty, was a reminder that human nature will always wriggle free from its paperwork. The more society tried to regulate joy, the more inventive joy became. In hindsight, the Edwardians' greatest fear wasn't immorality, it was irrelevance. The world was moving toward a new kind of freedom. Faster, messier, less predictable. The telephone was shrinking distance, cinema was democratizing imagination, and women were demanding not just visibility but agency. The old moral order felt like a fragile dam against a roaring tide. Each law they passed was another sandbag piled against modernity. But sandbags, as it turns out, make poor fortresses. Then came the cataclysm that shattered the illusion of control entirely. World War I, in the trenches, class, gender and etiquette, all drowned in mud. The war was chaos made visible, industrialised, mechanical and merciless. It mocked every Edwardian pretence of moral order. When the guns finally fell silent, so did many of the old laws. The world that merged afterward had little patience for curfews, corsets and permits for happiness. The war had proven that civilization couldn't be managed by rules. It had to be lived, uncertainly, passionately and often foolishly. Yet the Edwardians left a strange and lasting legacy. Their mania for control paved the way for the modern administrative state. The idea that every problem has a form, every citizen a file. They created the blueprint for 20th century governance, complete with its hypocrisies and endless paperwork. But they also left behind something more human, a record of a society desperately trying to keep its balance while the ground shifted beneath it. Their laws were absurd, yes, but their fear was deeply understandable. They were watching the world they knew vanish in real time, and what's more frightening than that? The great irony is that the Edwardians, who feared disorder above all else, helped create the modern freedoms they tried to suppress. Their crackdowns on expression made people fight harder for the right to speak. Their moralising about women's behaviour fueled the women's movement. Their anxiety over leisure helped define it. The more they tried to control life, the more vividly life defined itself in opposition. Out of their overregulation came rebellion, humour, and eventually change. Looking back, it's hard not to feel a certain fondness for their fussiness. They wanted so badly for everything to stay proper, polished and predictable. They built an empire of manners and then panicked when people started living in it. In their own stiff, absurd way, the Edwardians remind us that every generation's nonsense is just the next generation's normal. What they called scandal we now call Saturday. The good news, the Edwardians taught us that no society can legislate away its own humanity. The bad news? They probably would have made you fill out a form to agree with that.